Pre-Civil War period. The trade union movement. During the pre-Civil labor movement in the United States, officers accept during the pre-Civil War period, the trade union movement practically stopped at the Mason-Dixon line, although a few trade unions were organized and successful strikes conducted in the antebellum South. Four labor organizations existed in New Orleans before the Civil War: the Mechanics Society, the Typographical Society, the Screwmen's Beneficial Association, and the United Laborers' Beneficial Society. 2 of these organizations were mutual aid societies, but the Screwmen's Association and the Typographical Society were militant trade unions. In 1854, when it had 324 members, the Screwmen's Union won a strike which raised wages from $2.50 to $3 a day. In the same year, the New Orleans Typographical Society waged a successful campaign against the Associated Press, which took advantage of the Depression by reducing wages 25%. When the Associated Press resorted to importing strikebreakers from New York, the New Orleans Daily Picayune canceled the A.P.S. service. "We hold that the laborer is worthy of his hire," it declared, "and we can assure the public that we shall never be leagued with an association that has among its objects the deprivation of the laborer of a fair compensation for his services." When the split in A.P. ranks and the solidarity of the printers forced the employers to capitulate. On May 7, 1855, the New Orleans Commercial Bulletin announced, 01. Course everybody knows that the Associated Press has been compelled to succumb to the Typo Union. We have struck our colors, not ignominiously, but from sheer necessity. We have been overwhelmed by numbers, and there is no disgrace for the weaker party to yield to the stronger. All past questions between our compositors and ourselves are reconciled, and the entente cordiale is fully established. 2. Crewmen were workers who packed cotton bales into the hold of a ship. 249. 250. Labor movement in the United States. These trade union successes do not obscure the fact that Southern workers did not contribute much to the early development of the American trade union movement. The 3.5 million slaves in 1860 could not organize into trade unions or bargain collectively for higher wages, shorter hours, and better working conditions. And whenever the free, white workers tried to organize, they found the bitter resistance of the slave power. Slavery. The organization of slave labor in the antebellum South was based on the task system and the gang system. The former was used on rice and tobacco plantations, and meant that the daily quantity of work to be done was divided into quarter hands, half hands, or three-quarter hands, according to the strength of the workers. In theory, the work required of each slave was not too hard, but in practice the slaves were usually required to perform other tasks when their labor in the fields was finished. Lieutenant Anberry, who visited a tobacco plantation where the task system was enforced, described its operation in his diary. "They, the slaves, are called up at daybreak, and are drawn out into the field immediately, where they continue at hard labor, without intermission till noon, when they go to their dinners, and are seldom allowed an hour for that purpose. After they have dined, they return to labor in the field, until dusk in the evening. Here one naturally imagines the daily labor of these poor creatures was over. Not so, they repair to the tobacco houses, where each has a task of stripping, allotted which takes them up some hours, or else they have a quantity of Indian corn to husk, and if they neglect it, are tied up in the morning, and receive a number of lashes." 3. Cotton was produced by the gang system. The slaves worked under the constant supervision of overseers who used drivers to set the pace. From sunup to sundown the slavers worked in the cotton fields 6 days a week. "The hands," wrote a resident of Mississippi, "are regularly roused, by a large bell or horn, about the first dawn of day, or earlier, so that they are ready to enter the field as soon as there is sufficient light to." The labor of ditching, trenching, cleaning the wastelands, and hewing down the forests on the plantation was usually done by Irish laborers, for the Negro's life was too valuable to be risked at this work. The Irish were also the chief element among the roustabouts on the steamers carrying the cotton bales. "The niggers are worth too much to be risked here," replied a captain to an inquisitive passenger. "If the patties are knocked overboard or get their backs broken, nobody loses anything." Ulrich B. Phillips, American Negro Slavery, New York, 1918, page 302. Labor in the antebellum South. Distinguish the bulls. The hands remain in the field until it is too dark to distinguish the cotton, having brought their meals with them. For wherever there were as many as 20 slaves, it was common to employ an overseer. If he produced plenty of cotton, the owners never asked how many slaves he killed. His wages were ordinarily from $200 to $60, but a real driving overseer often got $1,000. He might ruin the land, overwork young and old alike if he could get so many bales to the hand. All was overlooked. To get the requisite number of cotton bags, he used the whip regularly. "It must be very disagreeable to have to punish them as much as you do," The traveler Frederick Law Olmsted remarked to an overseer. Yes, it would be to those who are not used to it, but it's my business and I think nothing of it. Why, sir, I wouldn't mind killing a nigger more than I would a dog. 5 asterisk. The account books of the slave owners give a good index to the general standard of living of the slaves. In 1795, a South Carolina planter estimated the expense for a Negro including duty, board, clothing, and medicines at from $12 to $13 per year. 30 years later, General Thomas Pinckney wrote, "The average annual expense of plantation slaves in the lower county of South Carolina, extracted from the account of several executors and attorneys for 4 successive years, amounts to $35 per head." But this figure included, in addition to food and clothing, taxes, overseers' wages, medicinal costs, plows, tools, nails, locks, hinges, fishhooks, pipes, salt, etc. James L. Watkins, a statistician for the United States Department of Agriculture, has estimated that the annual cost of medical care, feeding, and clothing adult slaves working in cotton fields in 1822 came to $23.10. In 1845, 48 sugar planters in Louisiana informed the Secretary of the Treasury that the cost of furnishing their prime field hands with food, medical treatment, and clothing was $33, and for other slaves, $18 a year. 9 years later, a table was published in J. D. B. DeBau's Resources of the South, which placed the cost of feeding a slave, as deduced from 15 years' experience, at $7.50 annually, or about 2 cents a day. 6. No wonder Frederick Law Olmsted wrote after a tour of the South in 1856. In fact, under favorable circumstances, on the large plantations the slave's allowance does not equal in quality or quantity that which we furnish the rogues in our penitentiaries. 7. Asterisk. In January 1854, the British consul at Charleston, in a private letter, wrote, "The frightful atrocities of slave holding must be seen to be described. My next door neighbor, a lawyer of the first distinction, and a member of the Southern aristocracy, told me himself that he flogged all his own Negroes, men and women, when they misbehaved. It is literally no more to kill a slave than to shoot a dog." Laura A. White. The South in the R85 O's as seen by British consuls, Fauconal of Southern History. Volume 1, February 1935, page 33. 252. Labor movement in the United States. Resistance. Unquestionably, there were Negroes who accepted their oppression. There were some household slaves who did not share with their brothers and sisters an unalterable hatred of slavery. But for 2 centuries the slaves struggled by every conceivable means to gain their freedom. While this struggle could at no time take the form of trade union struggle, there are few pages in the history of the working class which are more important than the battles waged by the Negro slaves against their bondage, and no history of the American labor movement can omit this story. These struggles took 2 forms: individual acts of resistance and collective action. A striking example of the first method is seen in a letter from a Louisiana overseer to the absent owner. "As to the difficulty with Summer," he writes, "it arose from my having hit his wife a few light licks when backward to proceed to work, after which I proceeded to the field where Summer left his work to the distance of 20 or 30 yards with his cane knife in his hand and very much enraged, and said that he was not going to put up with it, and that I was an unjust man, and that I might go get my gun, kill him and bury him, but that he was not going to put up with any other punishment to himself or family." 8. Rather than put up with brutal punishment, some slaves killed their masters or overseers and then committed suicide. Slave suicide as a form of resistance was so common in some parts of the South that documents containing advice to planters on the handling of slaves always devoted considerable space to the subject. One such document explained that slaves often stifle themselves by drawing in the tongue so as to close the breathing passage, others take poison, or flee and perish of misery and hunger. 9 other documents warn planters to guard against the tendency of slaves to murder their own children to prevent them from growing up in bondage. In one instance, a father and mother mutually agreed to send the souls of their children to heaven rather than have them descend to the hell of slavery. After killing their children, both parents committed suicide. Another slave mother destroyed with her own hands every one of her 13 children, rather than have them suffer slavery. 10 other slaves adopted the more effective method of collective action by stopping work in protest against whippings and other forms of brutality. One such stoppage is discussed in a letter from a Georgia overseer to the absentee owner of the plantation. Labor in the Antebellum South. 253. "Sir, I write you a few lines in order to let you know that 6 of your hands have left the plantation, every man but Jock. They displeased me with their work, and I gave some of them a few lashes, Tom with the rest. On Wednesday morning they were missing. I think they are lying out until they can see you or your Uncle Jack." 11. Generally the slaves who stopped work fled to nearby swamps and forests, and sent back word that they would not willingly return until they were assured a redress of grievances. John Holmes, an ex-slave, told how he ran off and hid in the swamp after an overseer threatened to whip him, and remained there until he was given a guarantee that he would not be beaten. At last, he writes, they told all the neighbors if I came home they wouldn't whip me. I was a great hand to work and made a great deal of money for our folks. 12. A planter in North Carolina held out the following promise to slaves who had run away to the swamps and refused to return until promised freedom from punishment. If any or all of these will return to my plantation and to a sense of their duty in a reasonable time, I pledge myself to forgive them. 13. Tens of thousands of slaves fled and never returned, most of them escaping to the north. Escape called for tremendous courage and endurance because the fugitive slave had to travel at night through hundreds of miles of hostile territory, hide in swamps and forests, and gradually make his way to freedom. Theodore Weld, a leading abolitionist, wrote of one slave who escaped to New York in 1838. He had come 1,200 miles from the lower part of Alabama, traveling only at nights, feeding on roots and wild berries. He swam every river from Tuscaloosa, Ala, to Pennsylvania. 14. A typical advertisement in a southern newspaper reveals the dangers facing a fugitive slave. $50 reward. Ran away from the subscriber, living in Franklin County, North Carolina, on the 12th of Jan. Uri, 1817, a Negro man named Randall about 26 or 27 years of age. It is expected he has some marks of shot about his hips, thighs, neck and face, as he has been shot at several times. 15. No story of the runaway slaves is complete without the inclusion of the heroic unity between Negro and white that maintained the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad was a network of an unknown number of routes stretching northward from the upland country of North Carolina, Tennessee, Virginia, and Kentucky into Canada. W. Siebert estimates that there were 12 routes across Ohio alone, and that by 1840 every northern state from Wisconsin and Illinois east. According to Professor W. B. Hesseltine, between 1830 and 1860 as many as 0.2 slaves a year passed into the land of the free along the routes of the Underground Railroad. A History of the South, New York, 1936, page 258. 254. Labor movement in the United States. Ward was crossed by slaves on their way to Canada or into regions in the United States where they could be relatively safe from the kidnappers and agents of the planters. 16. Most slaves did not feel safe until they were in Canada, as is testified to in the following song. I'm on my way to Canada, that cold and dreary land, the sad effects of slavery, I can no longer stand. 11. A number of former slaves worked with the Underground Railroad either as agents or conductors, the most famous of whom was Harriet Tubman. After her escape from slavery, she determined to return to the South and rescue her aged parents, her brothers, sisters, friends, and any slave who would follow her to freedom. But I was free and they should be free, Harriet Tubman said soon after she reached the North. I would make a home in the North and bring them there. She engaged a Northern assistant to write to a free Negro in Maryland who could read and write, and who was willing to help slaves escape. The letter contained a code passage with a biblical reference. Read my letter to the old folks. It went, and tell my brothers to be always watching unto prayer, and when the good old ship of Zion comes along, to be ready to step aboard. Learning that her father was in trouble because he had helped a slave to escape, Harriet collected funds and returned to the South. She found that her father was to be tried the next week, so, as she put it, she removed his trial to a higher court. By bringing her parents to Canada, Harriet Tubman made 19 journeys to the South, rescuing about 300 slaves herself and inspiring other thousands to escape. By 1856 there was a price of $25,000 on her head. Thomas Wentworth Higginson, a New England leader of the abolitionist movement, called her the greatest heroine of her age, while the Negro slaves hailed her as the Moses of her people. 18. Many of the slaves who escaped from the plantations did not go north, but found refuge in the swamps, mountains, and forests of the South. Here they lived in communities which became the centers for expeditions against nearby plantations. The Norfolk Herald of May 12, 1823, stated that the citizens of the southern part of Norfolk County, Virginia, have for some time been kept in a state of mind peculiarly harassing and painful, from the too apparent fact that their lives are at the mercy of a band of living assassins against whose fell designs either the power of the law, or vigilance, or personal strength and intrepidity can avail. These desperados are runaway Negroes commonly called outliers. 19. Frequently these outliers were the leaders of the slave uprisings. Labor in the antebellum South. 255. Slave insurrections were not accidental or unplanned events in the life of the South. With historical records far from complete, at least 25 insurrections which involved 10 or more slaves have been reported during the history of American Negro slavery. Southern society was organized around the need to suppress the Negroes by force of arms. Each plantation had its private arsenal, and groups of plantations had a private army of patrollers who rode the country roads at night. As Governor Robert Y. Hayne of South Carolina put it, "A state of military preparation must always be with us a state of perfect domestic security. A period of profound peace and consequent apathy may expose us to the danger of domestic insurrection." 2-0. One Southern newspaper admitted that the slave owners never felt safe. "We of the South," it said, "are emphatically surrounded by a dangerous class of beings, who would repeat Santo Domingo * if they were made to believe that death would not follow their insurrection." 21. But many slaves rose up in revolt even though they knew that death might probably follow their insurrection. Nat Turner, the great Negro leader, told of one slave who joined his insurrection. "I saluted them on coming up, and asked, well, how came he there? He answered, his life was worth no more than others, and his liberty as dear to him. I asked him if he meant to obtain it. He said he would, or lose his life." A slave captured during Gabriel's revolt in Virginia in 1800 showed the same spirit in his testimony before the trial court. "I have nothing more to offer than what George Washington would have had to offer had he been taken by the British officers and put to trial by them. I have ventured my life in endeavoring to obtain the freedom of my countrymen, and am a willing sacrifice to their cause, and I beg, as a favor, that I may be immediately led to my execution. I know that you have predetermined to shed my blood. Why then all this mockery of a trial?" 22. Since many of the leaders of the slave insurrections were Negro mechanics or artisans, it was not surprising that the following program was urged by a committee of slave owners as a means of controlling the slaves more effectively. The great fundamental principle should be that the slaves should be kept as much as possible to agricultural labors. Those so employed are found to be the most orderly and obedient of slaves. There should be no black mechanics or artisans, at least in the cities. 23. The references to the slave revolts in Santo Domingo during the 1790s and early 1800s under the leadership of Toussaint Louverture. It resulted in the establishment of the Negro Republic in Haiti. 256. Labor movement in the United States. Few strikes before the Civil War were better organized than were some of the slave insurrections. Denmark Vesey's revolt in South Carolina in 1822 was so carefully organized that even the slave owners admit that for care and discipline and extent, there had been nothing to compare with it. A free Negro, Vesey was determined to help his people. He refused the advice of slave owners that free Negroes should return to Africa. He wanted to stay and see what he could do for his fellow creatures. Vesey organized the slaves for revolt, reading aloud to them from the Bible how the children of Israel were delivered out of Egypt from bondage. A contemporary record tells us, even whilst walking through the streets in company with another, he was not idle, for if his companion bowed to a white person, he would rebuke him and observe that all men were born equal, and that he was surprised that any one would degrade himself by such conduct, that he would never cringe to the whites nor ought anyone who had the feelings of a man. 6 months before the blow was to be struck in Charleston in July of 1822, Vesey and his colleagues had recruited close to 9,000 slaves and free Negroes within a radius of 50 miles of the city. Each slave had a task. One was the armorer who made about 250 pike heads. Another slave fitted the pike heads to handles. Still others spotted all stores which contained arms. All slaves who tended or were near horses were given instructions as to where to bring the animals. In spite of all their secrecy, informers entered the organization. Peter Poyas, a slave carpenter, warned the rebels, "Take care and don't mention it to those waiting men who receive presents of old coats, etc., from their masters, or they'll betray us." While the insurrectionists were laying their final plans to spread through Charleston, occupy the arsenal, and restore freedom to every slave, a house servant discovered the plot and reported it. Other betrayals came from slaves who had agreed to act as spies. 131 Negroes were arrested, and 35 were executed. Others were banished or transported to different states. The slave owners never knew how many slaves were involved in the insurrection. Peter Poyas and another slave were chained to the floor of a prison cell and brutally tortured to force them to tell the names of other rebels. Wearied through pain, and wanting to save his life, Poyas. There is evidence of the existence in December 1860 of a widespread secret organization of slaves in South Carolina, dedicated to secure freedom. J. R. Gilmore, a visitor in the region, observed, "There exists among the blacks a secret and widespread organization of a Masonic character, having its grip, password, and oath. It has various grades of leaders, who are competent and earnest men, and its ultimate object is freedom." Edmund Kirk J. R. Gilmore, Among the Pines, New York 1862, pages 20, 25, 59, 89, 90 to 91 3 Labor in the antebellum South. Companion finally began to yield. Peter raised himself, leaned upon his elbow, looked at the poor fellow, saying quietly, "Die like a man," and instantly lay down again. It was enough, not another word was extorted. Later, when the slaves were awaiting execution, Peter Poyas told them, "Do not open your lips, die silent as you shall see me do." All obeyed. 24 The greatest slave uprising before the Civil War was the Nat Turner insurrection in Southampton County, Virginia, in 1831. Born a slave in 1800 in that state, Nat Turner was a deeply religious person and believed that he received God's word to free his people. Early in 1831 he planned the strategy for a general uprising to begin in Southampton County, and then to spread throughout the South. On the night of August 21, I-831, the uprising began 70 miles from Richmond. Armed with broadaxes and side blades, the slaves marched to B.J. gaining recruits from plantations on the way. For a time they were successful, but the combination of state and federal troops was too powerful. Turner evaded arrest for more than 6 weeks but was finally captured and tried, and on November 1831, he was executed. Of the other Negroes who were brought to trial, 17 were executed and 12 transported. During the uprising, 57 whites and 73 Negroes were killed. After Turner's revolt, the slave owners were haunted by insurrections. "They live in constant fear upon this subject," observed a contemporary. "The least unusual noise at night alarms them greatly. They cry out, 'What is that? Are the boys all in?'" Negroes suspected of plotting insurrections were murdered, and the death sentence was imposed upon any person convicted of arousing among Negro slaves a spirit of insurrection, conspiracy, or rebellion. The legislatures tightened the laws against persons aiding runaway slaves, greatly restricted emancipation, limited even more the activities of free Negroes, and prohibited teaching to slaves of reading and writing. A Georgia law asserted that if any person should teach a slave to read and write, the slave shall be punished by fine and whipping. The offending teacher was to be punished by fine not exceeding $500 and imprisonment. It also provided that, if one free Negro teach another, he is to be fined and whipped at the discretion of the court. Should a free Negro presume to preach to, or exhort his companions, he may be seized without warrant and whipped 39 lashes, and the same number of lashes may be applied to each one of his congregation. 25. Some measures were taken to reduce the danger of insurrection by decreasing the exploitation of the slaves. South Carolina reenacted a law originally passed in 1740, limiting slave labor to 15 hours in the spring and summer and 14 hours in the fall and winter. Most of the states declared that no work was to be done on Sunday except that which 2=8. Labor movement in the United States was absolutely necessary. Georgia provided penalties for the master who overworked his slaves, and Louisiana decreed that slaves should be permitted 2 hours for dinner from May until November, and 1½ hours during the remainder of the year. These were ineffectual safeguards, but their presence on the statute books shows that although the slave insurrections never succeeded, they were not complete defeats, any more than were the unsuccessful strikes of the Northern workers. White workers and slavery. The spirit and courage of the insurrectionists inspired many abolitionists in their struggle to end slavery, and the ferocity with which the rebellions were crushed convinced new masses of people that slavery must be abolished. Consequently, the slave owners sought allies among their non-slaveholding neighbors. On June 30, 1855, the North Carolina Standard argued that persons who own no slaves are inseparably associated either by blood, affinity, interest, and business relations with those who do, and whatever contributes to weakening the power of the South in this respect, or to impair the safety and value of the institution, must fall in the end with equal force with equal ruin upon all. 26 Only a small percentage of the white population of the South derived their profits from the sweat and toil of Negro slaves. Not more than 500,000 Southern whites in 1860 maintained slaves who with their families numbered less than 3 million. The total white population of the slave states was 9 million, thus less than 1/3 of the white people of the South derived any benefit from the institution of slavery. Economic power was concentrated in a few thousand families who lived on the best lands and received 3/4 of the returns from the yearly exports. The federal census of 1850 revealed that 1,000 families received over 50 million a year, while all the remaining 660,000 families received only about 60 million. 26 Slavery was a blight to the whole South. Thousands of poor whites were living under conditions which were only to be compared with that of the Roman plebeians in the period of Rome's extreme decline. They lived in abandoned outhouses cultivating the old fields of large plantations, land which the owners had left because it was too unprofitable for slave labor. William Gregg, a public-spirited citizen of South Caro. Slaveocracy's leading publicist J. D. B. DeBow frankly admitted the Slaveholders possess generally but very small means, and the land which they possess is almost universally poor and so sterile that a scanty subsistence is all that can be derived from its cultivation, and the more fertile soil being in the hands of the slaveholders, must ever remain out of power of those who have none. James D. B. DeBow, The Industrial Resources, etc. of the Southern and Western States. /E.W. Oleans, Volume 2, page 106. Labor in the Antebellum South. 259. Lena estimated that at least one-third of the white population of his state lived under these conditions, if not worse. DeBow's review in 1860 estimated several million poor whites for the entire South. These poor whites on the soil were not the only poor whites in the South. William H. Seward argued in his famous speech, The Irrepressible Conflict, that slavery was an evil not only because it loaded the Negroes down with chains, but because it was scarcely less severe upon the freeman, to whom only because he is a laborer from necessity, it denies facilities for employment, and whom it expels from the community because it cannot enslave and convert him into merchandise. 27. An Alabama planter boasted, On my own place, I have now slave carpenters, slave blacksmiths, and slave wheelwrights, and thus I am independent of free mechanics. 28. Despite the high prices paid for slaves, and the relative inefficiency of slave labor in industry, employers found slave labor much cheaper than free labor. The DeKalb Mill in Georgia reported that a Negro worker cost $75 a year in contrast to $111 required for a white operative, while the Saluda Mill near Columbia, South Carolina, in which 128 adult slaves and children operated 1,500 spindles and 120 looms, reported a saving of 30%. During the 50s, slaves employed in a cotton factory at Jackson, Mississippi, were allowed 20 cents a day for board, while white workers received 30 cents. As far north as Baltimore, slave mechanics offered such serious competition to skilled German artisans that many of them were forced to leave the city. 29. The largest ironworks in the South, the Tredegar Iron Works in Richmond, Virginia, employed slave labor. When Robert Anderson took over the failing business in 1847, he replaced most of the free workers with slaves. From the difficulty of controlling in a slave state the white labor employed at high wages in the manufacture of iron, he wrote, I have come to the conclusion to introduce slaves to a great extent, having satisfied myself by experiment of the practicability of the scheme. By 1848 the company was making a $98,272 profit, and Anderson was preaching that all iron establishments in a slave state must come to the employment of slaves. S0*. By the middle 50s, however, the use of slaves in industry on an extensive scale proved unsuccessful. One student who has examined this question offers the following reasons for this failure. Slaves transplanted from the plantations to the factories failed to make productive mill hands, for since they were hired out for the period between planting and picking, the constant alteration between the land and loom prevented even a gradual accumulation of industrial skill. This could be obviated by the outright purchase of slaves, but that in turn entailed even greater difficulties. First, buying slaves meant a larger immediate outlay of capital. It was estimated that the initial investment would have to be 260. Labor movement in the United States. Slaves were not only preferred because of their cheapness, but as one owner of a cotton factory in Fayetteville, North Carolina, reported, with the blacks there is no turning out for wages, and no time lost in visiting masters, and other public exhibitions. 31. The ever-increasing competition of slave labor led to unemployment among free white workers and forced wages to the subsistence level of a slave. In August 1855, the Raleigh, North Carolina editor estimated that there were many hundreds and thousands of working-class families who were existing upon half-starvation from year to year. There are many in this city whose wives and children are suffering for the want of food and raiment, who, if they remain here, are doomed to drag out a miserable existence. William Gregg constantly spoke of the mass of unemployed white labor in the South. 82 by 1860, the wage scales in the South were the lowest in the nation. The daily wage in 1860 for day laborers in the North was about $R.U, whereas in most Southern states it was between 77 and 90 cents. The daily wage for carpenters in the North for the same year was about $2, while in many Southern states it did not exceed $R.56. While operatives in Georgia cotton factories were earning $7.39 a month, workers in textile mills in Massachusetts doing the same work were getting $14.57.33. Hand in hand with unemployment and low wages was the stigma upon manual labor which developed in the slave-holding states. Free labor could have no social standing in a society where labor was considered degrading and unworthy of a white man. The great curse of slavery with us, wrote Ebenezer Pettigrew, a prominent North Carolinian, is not the fanatical notion of its sinfulness, but the rendering manual labor and pursuits degrading in the eyes of prominent gentlemen, who had rather cheat than work. 34 Few immigrants came south because they were looked down upon in a society where to labor is to slave, to work like a Negro. 35 For the same reason, a group of New England factory girls who had been induced to come south by bonuses and higher wages found their position so unpleasant, owing to the increase by as much as 50%, and that in the face of constant insufficiency of funds. Secondly, bought labor was precisely the factor industry could not lure. The ownership of slave labor would freeze Southern industry at the start, denying it the capacity to expand and contract with relative ease. While an increase in production would demand a much larger outlay for the purchase of additional slaves, any slight depression, on the other hand, would bring relatively great losses. Slaves, unlike free labor, could not be fired and thrown onto the open market. On the contrary, their maintenance persisted, independent of profit or loss. Moreover, the forced sale of Negroes in a depressed market, like that of any other superfluous commodity, would entail great losses. Conversely, during prosperous U.S. periods, competitive demands of manufacturers and planters would serve to inflate the pence 9-pound slaves. Fabian Linden. Repercussions of Manufacturing in the Antebellum South. North Carolina Historical Review, Volume 17, October 1940, pages 326-27. Labor in the Antebellum South. 261. General degradation of the laboring class. That they returned to the North. 36 Other workers who came south left because there were no opportunities for their children in the trades. Charles Lyell, an English traveler in America, noted the following conversation which took place in Columbus, Georgia, in the late 40s. Several New Englanders who have come from the North to South Carolina and Georgia complain to me that they cannot push on their children here as carpenters, cabinet makers, blacksmiths, and in other of such crafts, because the planters bring up the most intelligent of their slaves to these occupations. 31 When the white workers in the Tredegar Iron Works went on strike in 1847, they were promptly prosecuted and summoned to court. The same thing happened in New Orleans a few years later when longshoremen turned out for higher wages. 38 Only the printers were successful in maintaining labor organization because the printing trade was one of the few in which there was no serious competition from slave labor. In general, however, strikes could not be successfully conducted in a slaveholding community. The South, Roger W. Shub points out, was hardly of a mind to bargain with workers of one race when it owned so many of another. 39. Much of the labor activity of free workers in the South before the Civil War was directed towards keeping Negro slaves out of mechanical pursuits. This does not mean that white and Negro mechanics constantly clashed. In many places in the South, white and Negro mechanics worked side by side with little friction. The Georgia Federal Union of March 18, 1836, reported that 10 or 15 white mechanics and some 20 or more Negroes are working well in a boat-building establishment. 6 years later, the English traveler J.S. Buckingham was impressed by the fact that in the cotton mills of Athens, Georgia, where white and Negro workers were working together, there was no difficulty among them on account of color, the white girls working in the same room and at the same loom with black girls and boys of each color, as well as men and women, working together without repugnance or object. Tie-in. 40 white and Negro mechanics worked for years in the same workshops in St. Louis, before the Civil War, and rarely was there any antagonism between them. 41. Yet the pre-war period in the South was one of unremitting effort on the part of white mechanics to curtail, or prevent the employment of Negro artisans. At first they relied on petitions. Thus, in 1830, a group of unemployed stonecutters of Norfolk, Virginia, petitioned the Navy Department in Washington to stop the employment of Negro slaves in the construction of a dry dock for the Navy. They were men of families, they declared, and found it impossible to keep their children from starving when forced to compete with slaves. They could not but help. B.W. 262. Labor movement in the United States. This engagement of Negroes as a most grievous imposition, detrimental to the laboring interest of the community and subversive to every principle of equality. When the Navy Department asked the engineer why he employed slaves, he promptly replied that he was saving money for the government. Negro slaves cost J 2 cents a day at a time when white stonecutters were asking from $1.50 to $2 a day. Of almost equal importance, he argued, was the fact that he was teaching the slaveholders that they could successfully use their slaves on industrial projects. It is important to the state, he concluded, where slaves constitute so great a portion of the laborers, that Virginians should learn how the blacks may be made so much more valuable than has hitherto been thought. Convinced by these arguments, the Navy Department approved of the employment of slaves on the project. The stonecutters of Norfolk appealed to Congress, but they received no support. 42. Occasionally white mechanics protested against the introduction of Negro slaves, as this practice would soon reduce their wages. When the workers in the Tredegar Iron Works turned out to prevent the use of slaves in the industry, they were told that their demands struck at the root of all the rights and privileges of the masters, and were pregnant with the evils of abolition. Slave labor remained. Point 43. Finally, the white mechanics turned to political action. At first they exerted little influence, but as their pressure increased, some legislation was enacted. In 1845, the legislature of Georgia made the employment of a Negro mechanic or mason, whether slave or free, illegal. Similar legislation was being considered in other states, and so strong became the popular feeling against the use of Negro slaves in industry that C. G. Memminger, a leader in Southern politics, predicted that ere long we will have a formidable party on this subject. 44. The slaveholders were alarmed. Any restriction of the use of slaves not only limited their power and authority but removed an important source of profit, for the planters often turned to industry in times of crisis, to hire out their idle slaves. A victory for white labor would establish a precedent. If left unchallenged, it would lead only to more and more restrictions on the authority of the slave owners. L. W. Spratt, editor of the Clarkston Standard, wrote, "They will question the right of masters to employ their slaves in any works that they may wish for. They may acquire the right to deter mine municipal elections. Thus the town of Charleston, at the heart of slavery, may become a democratic power against it." 45. Their reasoning was logical. The protest movement against the use of Negro slaves in industry organized white mechanics in the South, and once they were organized they called for democratic reforms. As a result, labor in the antebellum South. Of the pressure exerted by the working class, a number of democratic reforms were achieved. It was the industrial workers who were chiefly responsible for the abolition of imprisonment for debt in Virginia and Maryland, and for the incorporation into the constitutions of these states in 1850-51 of provisions dealing with the property rights of married women. 46. In Georgia, the mechanics associations forced the state legislature to pass a law in 1853 providing that the legal day for all white persons under 21 years of age in all cotton, woolen, and other manufacturing establishments or machine shops should be from sunrise to sunset, the usual and customary time for meals being allowed. 47. This was the only piece of labor legislation enacted in the South during the pre-Civil War era. The struggle for ad valorem taxation as a more equitable tax system reached considerable intensity in North Carolina. Although slaves from the age of 12 to 50 were taxed 5 3/4 cents per $100 of their value, land was taxed 20 cents and workers' tools and implements were taxed $1 per $100. A worker from Raleigh, North Carolina asked in 1860, "Is it no grievance to tax the wages of the laboring man, and not tax the income of their employer?" 48. The leader for equalized taxation was Moses A. Bledsoe, a state senator from Wake County. When he supported the recently formed Raleigh Workingmen's Association in 1858, the slaveholders read him out of the Democratic Party, but in 1860 he ran as an independent and was elected. The ad valorem campaign was a direct challenge to the political and economic privileges of slavery. 49. The change from attacking the slave to attacking slavery came about very slowly, and many white workers never made the transition. Yet, in L. 1860, Alfred E. Matthews noted in a report of his journey through the South, "I have seen free white mechanics obliged to stand aside while their families were suffering for the necessaries of life, when slave mechanics, owned by rich and influential men, could get plenty of work, and I have heard these same white mechanics breathe the most bitter curses against the institution of slavery and the slave aristocracy." 110. Virginia workers were calling for a constitutional convention which would bring the downfall of wire-drawing politicians and the rising up of respected laborers. Then will the old aristocracy be known as the dust that it is, and productive industry meet the reward that it merits. 51. The mechanics and working men of Lexington, Kentucky, a slaveholding state, adopted the following resolution at a public meeting in the spring of 1849, and at the same time ordered the publication of 20,000 copies of an address on emancipation. Resolved, that the institution of slavery is prejudicial to every interest of the state, and is alike injurious to the slaveholder and non-slaveholder. Labor movement in the United States. That it degrades labor, enervates industry, interferes with the occupations of free laboring citizens, separates too widely the poor and the rich, shuts out the laboring classes from the blessings of education, and tends to drive from the state all who depend upon personal labor for support. That while we recognize the right of property in slaves under existing laws, we hold that the laboring man has as full a right to his occupation and the profits of his labor, as the master to his slaves, and as slavery tends to the monopoly of as well as the degradation of labor, public and private right require its ultimate extinction. 52. Not until the 50s did the alliance between the poor whites and slaves begin to extend throughout the South. Southern papers began to attack the malicious whites. in the cities who were helping the slaves to organize rebellions. The Galveston, Texas, News of December 27, 1856, warned the planters to watch out for white men who are constantly inciting our slaves to deeds of violence and bloodshed. 4 years later, a large group of planters in Alabama met to discuss the danger created by low-down poor whites, who were joining with slaves in plots to overthrow slavery, after which land, mules, and money would be redistributed. The mob's Le Mercury commented that slaves are constantly associating with low white people who are not slave owners. Such people are dangerous to the community. 54 equally dangerous to slavery were the German-American communists, who organized opposition to slavery in a number of southern states. Adolphe Douay, who later became a leading Marxist, published a weekly abolitionist paper, the San Antonio Zeitung, from July 5, 1853, to March 1856. Before the Zeitung started publication, there were several small anti-slavery bulletins published by an association of German workingmen in San Antonio, all of whom were communists, and most of them followers of Wilhelm Weitling. 55 Though the Texan slave owners drove Douay out of the community, they could not, as they learned during the Civil War, destroy his anti-slavery ideas. During the war, a leaflet was distributed in San Antonio, Texas, by a group of German-American communists, calling upon the people to rise up against the Confederacy. Although the revolt did not materialize, General McCulloch, writing to Jefferson Davis from San Antonio, admitted that the tract speaks the sentiments of a large portion of the population here, many of whom are doing all they can to injure our cause secretly, and would do so openly if they dared. 56. In 1868, Douay received a newspaper from Texas which carried the FO1 Lowing announcement in bold type at the head of the first column. This paper, edited and set by Negroes, is being printed on the same press from which Dr. Douay for the first time advocated the emancipation of the Negroes in Texas. Let this serve him as a token of gratitude of the colored race that they preserve the memory of his efforts for their freedom. Morris Hillquit, History of Socialism in the United States, New York, 1903, page 191, New Yorker Volkszeitung, No. 4, 1888. Labor in the Antebellum South. Slavery's Dilemma. As the 50s drew to a close, the small oligarchy of slave owners faced an ever-increasing class war. It is this great upheaving of our masses, wrote J. H. Taylor, a South Carolinian in 1850. We have to fear as far as our institutions are concerned. The people, observed a citizen of Montgomery, Alabama, 10 years later, are divided into two classes, the rich and the poor, who are as distinct and separate as the North Pole is from the South Pole. 67 The slave owners faced still another dilemma in the 50s. To keep slaves out of industry meant to open the way for the rise of a free working class which was by nature hostile to the planter aristocracy. To permit the slaves to work in the factories would weaken the entire slave system, for experience had demonstrated that slaves engaged in industry speedily became leaders of struggles for freedom. Furthermore, the use of slaves in industry, which had seemed extremely feasible in the early 184s, proved unsuccessful in actual practice. The slave owners met these problems by throwing their full weight against the rise of industry in the South. Those who advocated the growth of Southern industry complained bitterly of the opposition of the slaveholders who, relentlessly hostile to the rising menace, fought mainly to block the establishment of factories. 68 The nature of the menace was stated simply by the Morehouse Advocate, a Louisiana paper. The great mass of foreigners who come to our shores are laborers, and consequently come into competition with slave labor. It is to their interest to abolish slavery, and we know full well the disposition of man to promote all things which advance his own interests. 69 The Charleston Standard, a leading slaveholders' organ, agreed. A large proportion of the mechanical force that migrate to the South, it declared in the 50s, are a curse instead of a blessing. They are generally a worthless, unprincipled class, enemies to our peculiar institutions, pests to society, dangerous among the slave population, and ever ready to form combinations against the interests of the slaveholder, against the laws of the country, and against the peace of the Commonwealth. 60 Horace Greeley in 1853 said that the slaveholders were quite logical in opposing the entrance of workers from the North into the Cotton Kingdom. Every free laborer taken to the South, he observed, is a fresh nail in the coffin of slavery. 61 By stifling the rise of industry, the slave owners were able for the time being to retard the growth of the free working class in the South, but they could not prevent workers in the North from driving nails in the coffin of slavery. Though slow to become active in the struggle, Northern labor was to do more than its share to hasten the burial of human bondage in America. The struggles of American labor before the Civil War for higher wages, shorter hours, and better working conditions were interlocked with the struggle against Negro slavery. Eventually, the wage workers had to throw all their strength into that struggle, for they now understood that not until slavery was smashed could the working class advance. This understanding did not come about overnight. From the very outset of the struggle against chattel slavery, there were groups of workers ready to join in the demand for the end of human bondage in America. The platforms of many of the labor parties formed in New York State during the early 30s contained planks calling for the abolition of Negro slavery, the darkest, foulest blot upon the nation's character. One included in the Workingman's Prayer, submitted in 1830 by the trade unions of Massachusetts to the state legislature, was the appeal: "May the foul stain of slavery be blotted out of our fair escutcheon, and our fellow men not only declare to be free and equal, but actually enjoy that freedom and equality to which they are entitled by nature." 2 Thomas Wentworth Higginson writes in his memoirs that the anti-slavery cause was far stronger for a time in the factories and shoe shops of New England than in the pulpits or colleges. Higginson was not referring to the capitalists who owned these factories and shops. These businessmen had a lucrative market in the Cotton Kingdom. What a New York businessman told an abolitionist in 1835 was repeated by his colleagues in Boston and Lowell, where, as in the Empire City, there was a triple entente between the lords of the lash, the lords of the loom, and the lords of the long wharf. 3. "We cannot afford, sir, to let you and your associates endeavor to overthrow slavery. It is not a matter of principle with us. It is a matter of business necessity. We mean, sir, to put you abolitionists down by fair means if we can, by foul means if we must." For 266. Northern labor and slavery. That conservative businessmen would use foul means to put down the abolitionists did not surprise workingmen. Foul means were always used to break strikes. During the campaign in Congress by the slave owners and their northern allies to deprive the abolitionists of the right of petition, the Philadelphia Trades Union observed that the petitions of the abolitionists and those of the trade unions in behalf of the 10-hour day received the same treatment. 5 William Leggett, acting editor of the New York Evening Post and a spokesman for the labor movement during the Jacksonian era, attacked the government's interference with the male privileges of the anti-slavery journals, and warned the workers that their journals would be next. 6 When the mayor of Philadelphia prevented Francis Wright from lecturing in that city on the subject of slavery, the National Laborer stated, "The people need not be surprised at this, when they remember that it is the same mayor who demanded the enormous bail of $2,500 for the appearance of the Schuylkill laborers to answer the charge of riot, who were afterwards discharged because there was no crime found against them." 7. Uncertainties. There was a growing conviction among the workingmen that to preserve their own civil and political liberties they had to support the struggle for the democratic rights of the abolitionists to fight slavery. The Lowell girls said as much when they organized a female anti-slavery society in 1832, and when a few years later they campaigned for signatures to petitions urging the abolition of slavery. 8 This anti-slavery agitation was their atonement for working on raw materials produced by slave labor. Southern businessmen threatened the employers that if their workers did not stop their anti-slave agitation, they would buy clothing and shoes elsewhere. The employers fumed, but the Lowell and Fall River factory girls still held their annual fairs at which they raised money for the abolitionist movement, and many a mechanics association bade the abolitionists Godspeed in their undertaking. 9 There were workingmen who believed that the isolated activities of mechanics associations and factory girls should be developed into a nationwide campaign by free labor to bring an end to chattel slavery in America. In 1836, the Working Men's Association of England, parent body of the Chartist movement, addressed an appeal to American work heirs urging them to begin such a campaign. Their proposal was seconded by Lewis G. Gunn, a Philadelphia labor leader, who issued the following appeal to the workers of America. Labor movement in the United States. 268. As long as the pulse beats in my frame, the poor Negro in chains shall have my sympathy and much of my attention. Let me entreat you also never to forget the slave. Our voice should flounder from Maine to Georgia, and from the Atlantic to the Mississippi, the voice of a nation of Republicans and Christians demanding with all the authority of moral power, demanding the immediate liberation of the bondsman. 10. The English workingmen and Gunn were disappointed by the slim results of their appeals. Most workers were not yet ready to join a campaign to abolish slavery, and some were more willing to attack the abolitionists than the slave owners. Many obstacles had yet to be overcome before the wage workers of America could assume their proper role in the struggle to ankle slavery. Some workers in the 30s feared that the slavery question would cause a split in the Democratic Party, thus strengthening the foes of Jacksonian democracy. The slave owners were an important section in the Democratic Party, and fear of alienating them was expressed by leading trade unionists like Ely Moore, president of the New York General Trades Union, who declared that support of the abolitionist movement by the working class would be disastrous for the Jacksonian movement. If the Democratic Party were split, he said, the pro-bank, anti-Jackson aristocracy will have realized its fondest and most cherished hope. 11 Even when the Democratic Party was passing more and more under the domination of the slave owners, many Northern workers still hesitated to support the anti-slavery movement for fear of splitting the party. This was especially true of Irish American, German American, and other foreign-born workers who were constantly menaced by movements clamoring for legislation restricting immigration and extending the naturalization period required for citizenship. The Democratic Party opposed such laws, whereas the Whig Party, notoriously hostile to the foreign-born, openly sponsored these measures. A split in the Democratic Party, they believed, would mean the triumph of the anti-foreigner, anti-Catholic elements who hid their un-American principles behind the slogan of Americanism. To the fear of splitting the Democratic Party was added the fear that emancipation would bring thousands of Negroes to the northern states, increasing the competition for jobs and sending wages and living standards down. The northern allies of the slave owners played on these fears. In New York City, where business connections with the Cotton Kingdom were most highly developed, merchants, bankers, politicians, and the pro-Lutheran, satanic press initiated a well-organized campaign to convince the working class that the freedom DTHP slave would lower the northern labor and slavery conditions of the white laborer. That the abolitionists were, therefore, the enemies of the northern white workers. 12 The slave owners, by keeping the Negroes enslaved, were their true friends. To many workers who had a hard time supporting their families, these arguments were given weight by the hiring of non-union free Negroes to replace members of trade unions. 18 Probably none were more influenced by this pro-slavery propaganda than were the Irish American workers, who were mainly unskilled and could easily be replaced by Negro labor. The Catholic press often took the lead in disseminating the type of propaganda which played upon the natural fears of workers. Thus the Freeman/Orno, which was for a time the official organ of the Archbishop of New York and had a wide circulation among Irish American workers, regularly attacked abolitionism as an import from England, and charged that the emancipation of the slaves would ruin the white workers in the North. The point of view was typical of the stand taken in an important section of the Catholic press towards the slavery question, and undoubtedly exerted great influence on Catholics throughout the nation. Since the Catholic Church did nothing to counteract this influence, it acquired the reputation as being a protagonist of slavery. Some steps towards counteracting this reputation were taken by Catholic workers in Ireland. In 1841, an appeal was addressed to Irish Americans signed by 70,000 Irishmen, with Daniel O'Connell, the great Irish liberator, and Father Matthew, the prominent temperance leader, sponsoring the appeal. It denounced slavery and urged the Irish in America to identify themselves with the abolitionists. Irishmen and Irish women, treat the colored people as your equals, as brethren. By all your memories of Ireland, continue to love liberty, hate slavery, cling by the abolitionists, and in America you will do honor to the name of Ireland. 15 After the appeal, a series of meetings was organized by Irish workingmen in Boston and New York, to which abolitionist leaders were invited. At one such meeting in Faneuil Hall, Boston, Wendell Phillips, the abolitionist orator, read the O'Connell appeal to thousands of Irish workers, who enthusiastically applauded every paragraph and shouted negatives to his questions. Will you ever return to his master, the slave who once sets foot on the soil of Massachusetts? No, no, no. Will you ever raise to office or power the man who will not pledge his effort against slavery? No, no, no. 18 In a number of instances, however, Negro and white workers worked and went on strike together. Thus white carpenters and caulkers and Negro caulkers employed in the Navy Yard in Washington joined in a strike in July 1835. Michael Shiner Diary, July 28, 1835, Library of Congress, Manuscripts Division. Shiner, a free Negro, worked in the Navy Yard with white workers from 1812 to 1865. 270. Labor movement in the United States. Had the O'Connell address received the support of the Catholic Church and the Catholic press, it would have had more influence in Irish American circles. But Archbishop Hughes of New York denounced O'Connell, expressed doubt as to the genuineness of the Irish appeal, and said that genuine or not, it was the duty of every Irishman in America to resist and repudiate it with indignation as a foreign interference on questions of domestic and national policy. Most Catholic papers continued their campaign to convince white workers that the abolitionist program meant that after emancipation the Negro workers would crowd out the white worker. 17. Labor and the abolitionists. The abolitionists did little to overcome the fears of the working class regarding the so-called dangers of Negro emancipation. In fact, they did a good deal to convince many workers that they were concerned only with the welfare of the Negro slaves and considered the problems of free labor as insignificant. In the first issue of the Liberator, William Lloyd Garrison denounced the trade union movement as an organized conspiracy to inflame the minds of our working classes against the more opulent. Trade unions, he declared, were, in the highest degree, criminal, for they led workers to believe that their employers were their enemies. Perhaps, he added, it would be nearer the truth to affirm that mechanics are more inimical to each other than the rich toward them. 18 Garrison was not alone. The National Anti-Slavery Standard, official organ of the American Anti-Slavery Society, declared in 1847 that no true abolitionist could have any sympathy for those who denounced wage slavery as an evil. Even Wendell Phillips, who was later to fight for the freedom of the wage slaves, shared this view. Workers in the North, he wrote in 1847, had no real need for trade unions, for they were neither wronged nor oppressed. And even if they were, they had only to stay at home, and soon diminished supply will bring the remedy. 19 Fortunately, Phillips quickly changed his mind. A year later he opposed a resolution calling for the boycotting of products of slave labor on the ground that it was wrong to purchase or use the product of unpaid labor. Phillips argued that if this was the justification for purchasing only the products of free labor, then one logically would have to abstain from buying many other commodities besides cotton. Since there was much labor in the world which, though perhaps a little better paid than that of the slaves, was still unpaid, uncompensated, in any just sense. He pointed to the women shirtmakers, the factory operatives, the miners of England, and the laborers of Ireland as examples of workers who Northern labor and slavery 271 were miserably underpaid, and whose portion of the net profit of their several manufactories was far too small, unjustly so. I call payment, he added, that which secures the necessaries of life, some time and means of mental improvement, and something against age and sickness. This every industrious human being deserves for a day's work. 20. After some time, more and more abolitionist leaders adopted Phillips' viewpoint. Frederick Douglass, the great Negro abolitionist leader, spoke out frequently in behalf of the efforts of wage workers to organize for improvement of their conditions. He was hailed by trade unionists and invited by the Journeyman Printers Union of Rochester to attend an anniversary celebration of Benjamin Franklin's birthday. Horace Greeley was another opponent of slavery who did much to effect a rapprochement between abolitionists and sections of the labor movement. Greeley denounced abolitionists who refused to treat their workers decently, and even turned down an invitation to an anti-slavery convention because of the indifference of many of the delegates to the problems of Northern wage workers. 21. But until the viewpoint of some of the leaders of abolitionism towards the problems of free labor underwent a change, really cordial relations between them and most wage workers were almost out of the question. These workers definitely resented what they regarded as the tendency of abolitionists to stretch their ears to hear the sound of the lash on the back of the oppressed black, at the same time that they were deaf to the cries of the oppressed wage workers in the North. Devoted as she was to the anti-slavery cause, Sarah Bagley was forced, nevertheless, to denounce the abolitionist leaders for their failure to concern themselves also with the plight of wage workers in the North. What of the 10,000 girls, she asked Garrison, who without any warning were turned out on the streets of Lowell, to go where they pleased and as they willed? Other workers took up the cry and called upon the anti-slavery men to see to it at their conventions that the rights of the white slaves of the North are not forgotten. Still others condemned those abolitionists who expressed pity for the Southern slave, but would crush with an iron hand the white laborer of the North. 22. Such an attitude was expressed in the concluding verse of a poem published in many labor papers describing the death of a factory girl from starvation. Douglass spoke out just as frequently in criticism of the refusal of the trade unions to organize free Negro mechanics, or even allow them to work in the same shops with white workers. How sad it is, he declared in 1851, that our white fellow countrymen cannot find a class of original and heaven-sanctioned principles, which while they should be all sufficient to sustain the rights of white men should serve the opposite purpose for black men. Frederick Douglass / Paper, June 26, 1851. 2 of 2. Labor movement in the United States. That night a chariot passed her, W's isle on TL1E ground she lay, the dogglesters of her master, an evening visit pay, their tender lyres are sighing, as Negroes' woes are told, while the white slave was dying, W/10 gained their father's gold. 28. Wage slavery and chattel slavery. Most workers agreed readily that chattel slavery was an abominable crime, but they felt that their conditions in northern shops and factories were no less abominable. Slavery, as they saw it, did not consist of names but of facts. It mattered little to them whether the lash was of leather or of want and poverty, said the Manchester, New Hampshire operative. In 1844, a great cry is raised in the northern states against southern slavery. The sin of slavery may be abominable there, but is it not equally so here? If they have black slaves, have we not white ones? Or how much better is the condition of some of our laborers here at the North than the slaves of the South? It may be said that he enjoys his liberty, but how many of our workingmen, how many of the operatives in our mills, enjoy anything worthy of the name of liberty? Our laborers may work as the capitalist dictates, or not, but if they do not, they must starve. And if they work, the capitalists derive 9/11ths of the products of their labor. How much better, then, we ask, is the condition of some of our white, northern laborers than some of the black southern slaves? 24. Robert Dale Owen, Albert Brisbane, and Horace Greeley opposed not only Negro slavery but all forms of slavery. Their ideas are incorporated in the following statement adopted at a meeting of 25,000 New York workingmen held in January 1845. To slavery in the abstract, slavery in the concrete, to slavery absolute, slavery feudal, and the slavery of wages, to slavery where it is, and where it is not, from the first Israelite who leaned his ear against the door, and was pierced with his master's awl to the last son of Adam who shall wear the badge of servitude, to slavery we are utterly opposed under every phase and modification. And so with firm and solemn purpose will remain until our lives end. 25. Northern Labor and Slavery. 273. There were some in the ranks of labor who argued that the workers should concern themselves primarily with the struggle against wage slavery. The National Laborer stated on September 17, 1836, that while it opposed slavery in every form, either over the body, mind, color, or degree, it felt that it was the duty of organized labor to begin to secure to the workingman the right of disposing his own labor at his own price, and to make that price just and equivalent to his toil. But it was the return of George Henry Evans from retirement to lead the land reform movement that marked the influence within the working class of the idea of precedence of the fight against wage slavery. Unlike the Owenites and the Associationists who fought against all forms of slavery simultaneously, Evans and other land reformers took the position that the abolition of wage slavery was the only important problem facing the working class. Since the controversy over Negro slavery detracted the workers from the main problem confronting them, they had better forget about chattel slavery. Then could they triumphantly devote all their time and energy to the one program which would abolish wage slavery land reform. Evans also urged the abolitionists to join his crusade instead of frittering away their time with petitions to Congress. Land reform, he assured them, would lead more quickly to the abolition of chattel slavery than would any number of petitions and mass meetings. Thus Evans predicted that if Congress passed a land reform law in 1850, the following wonderful situation would exist in the South 20 years later. In the southern states, chattel slavery is gradually dying out under the operation of the Free Public Land Law. The emancipated Negroes have formed a settlement on the public lands almost large enough for a state and are debating whether they shall follow their brethren to Liberia or ask to be recognized as an independent state. 26. To justify his theory that wage slavery should be abolished first, Evans followed the arguments of the slave owners and their northern allies whose favorite defense of slavery was the contrast between the poor, miserable, manacled, starving, naked, free worker of the North and the happy slaves of the South, surrounded with every comfort for animal indulgence, cared for in sickness and in old age by a benevolent master. Free laborers, wrote George Fitzhugh, a prominent Southern apologist. On June 2, 1845, the Harbinger, organ of the Associationists, offered the following advice to the abolitionists. We are convinced that if the leaders in the abolition movement would embrace in their attacks the two kinds of slavery, the most prevalent in this country, chattel slavery at the South, and the slavery of capital, or the wages system at the North, black slavery and white slavery, this extension would give them immense additional power. 274. Labor movement in the United States. Have not the thousandth part of the rights and liberties of Negro slaves. 27. Though Evans never openly justified slavery, he supplied the slave press with useful arguments. He argued that to free the Negro people for wage slavery would be a great disadvantage to the slaves, as they would exchange their surety of support in sickness and old age for poverty and unemployment. 28. Abolition of slavery, he maintained, would harm the northern worker by throwing millions of black workers on the labor market, driving down the wages of the whole working class. Thomas Dever, one of Evans' disciples, said, "Emancipate the white man first, free him from the thraldom of his unsupplied wants, and the day this is done, will commence the manumission of the much wronged black man within our borders." 29. This contention that freeing the slaves under the wage system would threaten northern workers met with approval among some Irish American laborers, and Evans' radical-sounding words impressed groups of German Americans. It is extremely doubtful that many northern workers accepted Evans' statement that wage workers were worse off than Negro slaves. Why was it, they asked, that so many slaves risked their lives to escape their security? And why was it that no free Negroes in the North were known to have run the other way? Organized workers understood the fundamental distinction between chattel and wage slavery. Wage workers could organize and struggle legally to improve their conditions. An operative mechanic wrote in the Democrat of March 24, 1836. The observation has been made on the floor of Congress that the mechanical and laboring population of the North are a parable class to the slaves of the South. So long, however, as that class retains their power which they yet possess to right their wrongs peaceably through the ballot boxes, such assertions tend but to exhibit the ignorance or rashness of those that gave utterance to them. Almost 25 years later, in February 1860, a worker expressed the same idea at a meeting of striking shoe workers in Lynn, Massachusetts. "You know we are not a quarter as bad off as the slaves of the South, though we are by our foolishness 10 times as bad off as we ought to be. They can't vote, nor complain, and we can. Then just think of it, the slaves can't hold mass meetings, nor strike, and we haven't lost that privilege yet, thank the Lord." 30. Northern labor and slavery. In New England, where the land reformers had little influence, the organized workers rejected Evans, and the New England Workingmen's Association urged the slaves to revolt for freedom, justified their right to do so, and called upon Northern workers to refuse to join in any military movements to crush these revolts. "We recommend to our brethren to speak out in thunder tones, both as associations and as individuals, to let it no longer be said that the Northern laborers, while they are contending for their rights, are a standing army to keep 3 million of their brethren and sisters in bondage at the point of the bayonet." 31. On May 9, 1848, a mass meeting of trade unionists was held in Faneuil Hall in Boston, in honor of the European revolutions of 1848. Among the resolutions adopted was one which stated, "While we rejoice in the organization of free institutions in the Old World, we are not indifferent to their support at home, and we regret the despotic attitude of the slave power at the South, and the domineering ascendancy of the money oligarchy are equally hostile to the interests of labor and incompatible with the preservation of popular rights." 83. "Down with both chattel slavery and wage slavery," was the slogan of the day among the New England workers. How strongly they opposed slavery was expressed in 1852 by George W. Putnam, an abolitionist field organizer in New England. "The factory operatives," he wrote to Garrison, "felt that the Northern capitalist was closely akin to the Southern slaveholder, and that the design of the slave power and the money power is to crush both black and W.H.T. 33. A follower of Evans addressed the delegates to the New England Workingmen's Association in 1846. Like Evans, he urged them to forget slavery in the South and to abolish wage slavery in the North through land reform. The delegates disagreed and resolved that American slavery must be uprooted before the elevation sought by the laboring classes can be effected. 34. The organized workers in New England said in 1846 what Karl Marx was to say years later. In the United States of North America, every independent movement of the workers was paralyzed so long as slavery disfigured a part of the republic. Labor cannot emancipate itself in the white skin wherein the black it is branded. 81. Before Marx, Elihu Burritt, the learned blacksmith, explained in his addresses to workers that slavery degraded free workers by forcing them to compete with chattel slaves, that in the minds of Northern capitalists the condition of slaves was accepted as the baseline, the point of departure of their operations, that somehow it must determine the compensation and honor for free labor. 36. Burritt was not the only new 276 labor movement in the United States. England thinker to recognize these truths. "Many of the wisest of the labor men," wrote George E. McNeill, a contemporary trade unionist, were of the opinion that no great progress could be made until after the destruction of the chattel slave system. 37. The New England labor press frequently stressed the same theme. The Voice of Industry editorialized in 1847, "The question of slavery is in truth a question of labor. Whenever the rights of labor are discussed or upon whatever department of labor reform we insist, the influence of slavery is arrayed against us." 1 year later, The New Era, a Boston workingman's paper, expanded on this theme. "You cannot touch a single question of general policy in which slavery does not get some moral thrust. It cannot be avoided. Slavery must be extinguished. Whatever may be the question, this enormous dragon has something at stake. We go for direct and internecine war with the monster." 38. It was too much to expect, however, that most workers would accept so advanced a position in 1848. Indeed, the majority of workers did not at any time before the Civil War advocate that slavery must be extinguished. But gradually, more and more workers learned through experience that from the standpoint of their own class interests they too had to go for direct and internecine war with the monster. Impact of slavery extension. What brought the workers to an understanding of this position was that slavery did not remain in the South awaiting the day that the emancipated wage slaves would turn their attention to abolishing it. It expanded into territories outside of the slave states, and threatened to continue expanding indefinitely unless checked. It soon became apparent to most workers that if they followed Evans' advice and ignored the issue of chattel slavery, they would awake one fine morning and discover that all the land that was to emancipate them was in the hands of the slave owners. And if they continued to remain indifferent to this question, they would awake another morning to find themselves reduced to slavery. In 1844, the Jacksonville, Alabama, Republican stated, "The balance of power is already against us. Under the circumstances, the addition of Texas with its slaves is the only means of saving the South." 39 a year later, the slave owners secured the annexation of Texas. In 1846, they provoked a war with Mexico for more territory for slavery and for more Northern labor and slavery. Political power in the government. 4 years later, by threatening to secede from the Union, they terrorized enough conservatives in the North, particularly the businessmen engaged in Southern trade, to block the Wilmot Proviso, which would prohibit the existence of slavery in any part of the territory acquired from Mexico. By beating the drums of secession a bit louder, the slave owners extended slavery into Utah and New Mexico, and gained a more effective fugitive slave law. These victories did not satisfy the slave power. In 1854, the slave owners secured the repeal of the Missouri Compromise of 1820, and opened to slave settlement a region that Congress had declared free. In 1857, the Dred Scott decision ruled that slavery could not be prohibited in any territory of the United States, and that slavery had to be protected by the government in these territories. At first, many workingmen were not alarmed by the conquest of the slavocracy. Some agreed with George Henry Evans that the annexation of Texas was only another phase of the contest between rich and avaricious planters, and rich and avaricious manufacturers, for exclusive privileges. 40. The new era of industry, however, was alarmed at the aggressions of the slave power. Every succeeding day only renders the question of slavery more vexing. Its ugly face peers up from every cranny and dog hole into which it has attempted to hide it. 41. At workingmen's meetings in New York City in 1844 and 1845, opposition was voiced to the annexation of Texas, without provision for the extinction of slavery within her borders. To admit Texas as a slave territory into this union would, in the opinion of this meeting, have a tendency to strengthen the institution of slavery. 0. In New England, workingmen led by Elihu Burritt organized meetings to protest the annexation of Texas. The Manchester operative in August 1844 stated, "We have heretofore held our peace in regard to the annexation of Texas, for the purpose of seeing whether our nation would attempt so base an action. We call it base, because it would be giving men that live upon the blood of others an opportunity of dipping their hands still deeper in the sin of slavery. Have we not slaves enough now? Are not 2/3 of our population now in abject slavery? In the South we hear the clanking chains and heart-rending pleadings of the sons of Africa that they may have freedom, while in the North the voice of our laboring classes ascends up to heaven in earnest prayer, that they too may be free from the galling yoke of aristocratic power. What a picture our country presents then! Why add more of this corrupting evil to the already heart-sickening fact of slavery and bondage?" 43. Irish workers in large numbers demonstrated in New York, Boston, and Lowell against the annexation of Texas, showing that although they 278. Labor movement in the United States were unwilling to join the abolitionists, they were opposed to the extension of slavery. Irish workers were also present at a meeting called by New York workingmen in May 1846 to oppose the Mexican War. This meeting branded the war as a scheme of the slave owners and their allies who lived in such luxurious idleness on the products of the workingmen. They demanded of President Polk that further hostilities be avoided by withdrawing American troops to some undisputed land belonging to the United States. 44. Speaking through their delegates at the 1846 convention of the New England Workingmen's Association, the organized workers of New England denounced the foul disgrace of extending the area of slavery, and pledged that they would not take up arms to sustain the Southern slaveholder in robbing 1/5 of our countrymen of their labor. 45. The division in the ranks of the workingmen on the slavery question continued through the controversy over the Wilmot Proviso. The Gr. Men American workers, meeting in a national convention when the debate over the proviso was reaching a climax in Congress, did not adopt a single resolution on chattel slavery. The opportunism of Wilhelm Whiteling, and of Herman Krieg, a land reformer who outdid Evans in his insistence that wage workers ignore the slavery question, was mainly responsible for this silence. 46. Other workers who advocated land reform at first adopted the attitude of their leaders. According to the leaders, the Wilmot Proviso was humbug to cover up the extension not of Negro slavery, but of white slavery. All slavery would end through land reform. But as the politicians have not the most distant idea of elevating the masses, and as this would do it, they wish to raise new and unimportant issues to draw people's attention from the land proviso, so as to perpetuate the greatest slavery of all slavery, poverty under the accursed system of land monopoly. 47. A similar stand was taken by the New York City Industrial Congress in the summer of 1850, when it declared that the contest in Congress was one in which we as workers take no special interest, except in so far as the American Union may be endangered thereby, sincerely believing that it is only a contest between the capitalists of the South and the North as to which shall have the most chattel slaves or the most wage slaves. Resolved, that we consider the freedom of the public lands of the first importance. 48. There is considerable evidence that even that section of the working class in the land reform movement was becoming concerned over the aggressions of the slave power. In June 1850, the National Industrial Congress condemned slavery as a moral, social, and political evil. They resolved that we are opposed to the further extension of slavery, and view with abhorrence the idea that to satisfy the South, and to secure the Northern labor and slavery perpetuation of the Federal Union, the people of the United States must agree that the slave as well as the free area shall be extended. Slavery can never be a bond of union and of freedom. 49. After the Compromise of 1850, the Sons and Daughters of Toil of Philadelphia, a land reform organization, attacked Congress for having degraded labor by enacting fugitive slave bills and compromise acts. This organization affirmed that labor on the soil, in the workshop or factory is, and of right ought to be free without reference to sex, color, or condition. 50. When the infamous Kansas-Nebraska bill to repeal the Missouri Compromise was introduced into Congress, few workers were silent and none were indifferent. New leaders had emerged from the German-American workers who immediately joined the small group of anti-slavery men and women who were fighting the battle of freedom and civilization. Chief among these leaders were the communists, followers of Karl Marx, who had come to this country after the defeat of the Revolution of 1848 in Germany. With Joseph Wedemeyer as their leader, they soon became the most effective opponents of slavery in the labor movement. The Communist Club of Cleveland, Ohio, resolved late in 1851 to use all means which are adapted to abolish slavery, an institution which is so wholly repugnant to the principles of true democracy. 51 communist clubs contributed liberally towards spreading the light on this question, and they were so downright in their opposition to the slaveholders as to call any of their members promptly to account who fell under the slightest suspicion of sympathizing with the South. 52. The Marxists set out to convince the working class that free labor could not emancipate itself as long as chattel slavery existed, that the expansion of slavery would immensely undermine the power of free labor, and that unless the slave power was smashed, slave labor would become the dominant labor system in the factories and shops of the North, as it was fast becoming in the fields of New Mexico. 53. A worker who was very active in the struggle against slavery during the 50s remarked years later that the reduction of working hours had much to do with the vigorous role labor played in the anti-slavery movement after 1854. In 1854, he wrote, "The country was in the throes of the great contest which ended in civil war. The audiences all over the land were largely composed of the same class of people who rushed tumultuously into the village church, but they were not working 14 hours, only 10. I suggest the inquiry to those who resist the reduction of the hours of labor. Could a population of 14-hour men have conducted the debate on the conflict, as we did? I say emphatically no. The history of our country for the last half-century would have been reversed. Some disgraceful compromise between liberty and slavery would have intervened to the postponement of the noble ideas now before us." Edward H. Rogers, Autobiography, manuscript copy written in 1902, in Wisconsin State Historical Society, Chapter 5. 280. Labor movement in the United States. The Slaveholders' Program. The penetrating analysis of the Marxists was proved by the insane logic of the slave owners. Enslave them all, Negro and white workers alike, they cried. Why be troubled with the free working class? Keep labor on a level with beasts of burden, for as soon as the mere laborer has the pride, the knowledge, and the aspirations of a free man, he is unfitted for his situation. Slavery was right, natural, and necessary for all workers, regardless of their complexion. Slavery is the natural and normal condition of the laboring man, ranted the Charleston Mercury. Master and slave, it stated, is a relation in society as necessary as that of parent and child, and the northern states will yet have to introduce it. The theory of free society is a delusion. 54. Free society, the slave owners argued, was not only a delusion but a danger. In a free society, greasy mechanics and filthy operatives, who were hardly fit for association with a Southern gentleman's body servant, organized trade unions, engaged in strikes and other subversive activities. Abolitionism was only one of the many isms in the North. From the anti-slavery movement flowed inexorably common schools, socialism, and all other isms. None of these movements could develop in the South. Slavery, boasted one planter, protected the South from the demands for land limitation, anti-rent troubles, strikes of workmen, diseased philanthropy, radical democracy, and the progress of socialistic ideas in general. Northern capitalists should institute the system of slave labor in the North. It would relieve them of all anxieties caused by workingmen's parties, trade unions, and German Marxist socialists who insolently form associations and devise plans to improve our homely American institutions into the likeness of the bloody and drunken dreams of French and German liberty. Only an alliance between the Northern capitalists and the slavocracy could arrest the forces of abolition whose hidden object was the overthrow of all forms of property and the establishment of communism. Eventually, they argued, the Northern capitalists would learn that slavery was necessary for them. 55. It is true that these proposals to replace free labor with slavery in the factories and shops of the North were in direct conflict with the trend of capitalistic development in the United States. Wage labor was a necessity for this development, and slavery had no place in an economy of factories, railroads, and advancing technology. This did not, however, make the danger any less real for the Northern workers. They knew that slave labor was rapidly replacing free labor in Southern industry, and they were constantly reminded of this fact by their employers and the commercial dress whenever they organized to raise wages and reduce working hours. Northern labor and slavery. As early as 1844, workers in Fall River textile mills were told by the mill owners, "You must work as long and as cheap as the slaves of the South in order to compete with the Southern manufacturer." 56. 4 years later, the Philadelphia Daily Republic warned striking workingmen in Pennsylvania that if they did not put an end to their demands for increased wages and shorter hours, Northern manufacturers would move to the South and use slave labor in production. "Manufactures are practicable, safe, and successful in the South," it declared. "Slave labor can be, and is employed in them, and that labor is cheaper than the labor of the free white man, cheaper than the pauper labor of Great Britain. It is true that slaves are inferior laborers, where, without motive, interest, or any feeling of duty, they must be left to their discretion and cannot be overseen, as in small farming and other solitary occupations, but wherever they can be worked in gangs, and superintended as in the cotton field, forge, furnace, and large cotton and woolen factories, compulsion can easily be made to supply the place of zeal and 57. I dearest. In short, the degrading and paralyzing effects of chattel slavery were definitely threatening the status of every free worker in the United States. Color was no longer the barrier between the Negro slave in the South and the free white worker in the North. As one pro-labor paper put it, "They, Negro slaves, are valuable because they can be carpenters, and blacksmiths, and masons, etc., and hence every white laboring man in the country is compelled to have a direct interest in the question of the chattelization of labor." 58. Organized labor took up the challenge. More than 10,000 workers in Newark, New Jersey, in 1856, at an anti-slave rally passed the following resolution. Resolved, that we view with jealousy and suspicion the bold attempts which the slave power of the country is now making to degrade the laboring and producing classes of the people by establishing its system of chattel labor in the free territories of the West, and that we would repel and resent the efforts to introduce the black slaves into our work shops. Resolved, that the people in this city have abundant reason for sustaining free and independent labor, and our influence shall never be given to substitute for its slave labor. 59. At Manchester, New Hampshire, a protest meeting against the Nebraska infamy was crowded with workers. In Pittsburgh, the workers held a mass meeting to oppose the admission of slavery into Nebraska. Late in February 1854, 5,000 mechanics and workers met at the Broadway Tabernacle in New York City and resolved that the Nebraska bill was a base breach of compact and an attempt to degrade free labor. 282. Labor movement in the United States. They further resolved that we, the mechanics and working men of New York, heartily concur in the stern protests against the threatened repeal of the Missouri Compromise. A few days later, the German-American working men of New York City took a similar stand, and at a mass meeting of the Arbeiterbund on March 1, 1854, a resolution introduced by Joseph Wedemeyer received the unanimous approval of several thousand German-American workers. It asserted that since the Nebraska bill favored capitalist land speculation at the expense of the people, authorized the future extension of slavery, and withdrew vast tracts of land, making it unavailable for any future homestead bill, the German-American workers of New York, who have, do now, and shall continue to protest most emphatically against both black and white slavery, had no choice but to solemnly protest against this bill and brand as a traitor against the people and their welfare everyone who shall lend it his support. 61 similar meetings were held by workers in New Jersey, Illinois, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Massachusetts, Michigan, Vermont, Connecticut, Indiana, and Wisconsin. Each meeting adopted resolutions castigating the slave power and opposing the Nebraska bill. The workers of Philadelphia resolved that we are opposed to the introduction of the curse and infamy of human slavery into the virgin territory of the North. Shortly after the repeal of the Missouri Compromise, the National Industrial Congress met in convention and reversed their former stand that chattel slavery was of minor importance to the working class. They now correctly said that chattel slavery was first on labor's agenda, and they called upon the workers of the North to demand the immediate repeal of the Nebraska Bill, the Fugitive Slave Law, and the restoration of the Missouri Compromise. They voted that, in the future we will have no representative in our state or national councils who has not plighted his sacred honor to resent the aggressions of the Southern slave power, and to stand by the live ties of the citizens who elected him to power. 62. Emergence of the Republican Party. At the time that the National Industrial Congress pledged to support for political office only those candidates who would oppose the aggressions of the slave power, a new political party, dedicated to this purpose, was emerging. Out in Ripon, Wisconsin, Alvin E. Bovey, formerly the Secretary-Treasurer of the National Industrial Congress and a leader of the workingmen's movement in New York, was uniting liberals and reformers, disgusted with the Whig and Democratic parties, into a new political organization dedicated to fight the further extension of slavery and pledged to support a free land program. Upon this new political Northern Labor and Slavery organization, Bovey bestowed a name which his former leader, George Henry Evans, had used as far back as 1846. At that time, Evans had predicted that within a decade there would be but two political parties in America: the Great Republican Party of Progress and the Little Tory Party of Holdbacks. 63. Evans had used land reform as the dividing line between the two parties, but by the time Bovey gave the name, Republican Party, to the organization which emerged in Ripon, the campaign for land reform in opposition to the extension of slavery had become inseparable. Slaveholders knew that a homestead bill would prevent the expansion of slavery and give political strength to the anti-slavery forces. The North Carolina Standard said that it opposed the homestead bill because it would bring in new states in the Senate to vote us down upon every question affecting our vital interest, and finally to control the government. Absolutely. Representative Branch of North Carolina said that it was dangerous to slaveholders because it was supported by the labor movement, and was therefore the first step towards introducing communism and socialism. 64. The Republican movement spread rapidly throughout the Northwest, and soon became an influence in the industrial centers of the East. A general realignment was taking place in American political life. Democrats who refused to stay in their party when it was dominated by slave owners, and Whigs who were fed up with their parties straddling the slavery question, were looking for a new political organization. Conservative Whigs who surrendered at every threat of the slave power moved into the Know-Nothing movement, finally ending up in the Democratic Party. The newly formed Republican Party represented a coalition of different classes united by their opposition to the future encroachment of the slave power. Important sections of the Northern capitalists joined the Republican Party after it got underway and contributed considerable sums to its campaign chest. These industrial and mercantile capitalists were determined to wrest the control of the government from the slaveholders and their northern allies. To these capitalists, owners of cotton and woolen mills and iron furnaces, a victory for the Republican Party meant protective tariffs, government subsidies for the construction of railroads, opportunity to exploit the rich resources of the public domain, a national banking system, and a uniform currency. These measures were long overdue. For several years, Northern manufacturers had also opposed the Homestead Bill on the ground that it would induce workers to leah/e for the vest, thereby creating a layer scarcity in the East. Increased immigration and the desire to extend internal markets gradually caused the manufacturers to support a Homestead Bill. 284. Labor movement in the United States. But as long as the slavocracy dominated the government, they could not be achieved. It was time, thought these capitalists, that the planter aristocrats were removed from political influence, and the interests of Northern capitalism advanced. Said a newspaper spokesman for the Northern bourgeoisie, "If no measures of protection and improvement of anything North or West are to be suffered by our Southern masters, if we are to be downtrodden and all our cherished interests crushed by them, a signal revolution will eventually arise." 65. Not all Northern capitalists recognized the fact that slavery hindered the industrial development of the South, but men like John Murray Forbes, the anti-slavery Boston capitalist, Congressman Thaddeus Stevens, the progressive Pennsylvania iron master, Nathaniel Banks, and John Sherman, the political representatives of Northern industry, realized that slavery was the foe of all industrial progress and of the highest material prosperity. 66. Fear of losing Southern trade and the fear of secession caused most mercantile and many industrial capitalists to support the anti-Republican movement. William M. Evarts, a leading Republican, said in 1860 that the great share of the bankers, the great share of the moneyed interests of the Northern states, are combined with the slaveholders in support of slavery. These moneyed interests also feared that if the slaveholders were deprived of their property rights of taking slaves into the territories, a broader attack on all property rights would follow. They agreed with the New York Herald when it declared on October 26, 1860, that once the Republicans were victorious, the workers would soon turn their attention to the goods and chattels of their wealthier neighbors, having been long taught by the leading Republican journals the doctrine of the communists that all property is robbery. The Boston Courier spoke for those who believed that the Republican Party jeopardized property rights. The truth is, it stated on April 1, 1860, that republicanism is neither more nor less than radicalism. We do not mean that all Republicans are radicals. Far from it, but the operation of its doctrines are to this end. It is a struggle to escape from all restraints of order and law, and as a consequence you will find the whole body of speculatists upon morals, religion, government, and social revolution in its ranks. The Negro and his condition are mere incidents of the main question. The doctrines of the Republican Party, the conservatives believed, were already arousing the working class. How else explain the militant unemployment demonstrations during the Panic of 1857 and the Great Shoe Strike of 1860? These were, reasoned the conservatives of the North, the logical result of Republican doctrines. It was useless for the Republicans to protest that they did not advocate the abolition of slavery, to oppose Northern labor and slavery, the use of force and violence, to condemn men like John Brown for trying to organize slave revolts. Narrow class fears closed the minds of many businessmen whose broad class interests should have swept them into the Republican Party. Nor did the working class as a whole support the Republican Party. Many still remained within the Democratic Party because of its friendly attitude towards the foreign-born, and continued to battle inside that party for a policy in favor of free soil and against the further expansion of slavery. Quite a few Native American workers joined the Know Nothing movement. Some workers refused to join the Republican Party because it meant that they would have to join hands with capitalists who were exploiting workers and who called out the militia to break strikes. These men, said one worker, had no sympathy either for the white man or the Negro. Their only aim in joining the Republican movement was that capital shall obtain political power to direct the legislation of the federal government as it does now that of New England, and thus enable the few to govern the many. 67 Many workers understood that their hostility to their employers should not prevent them from supporting the Republican Party against the slavocracy, and they knew that most capitalists actually regarded the Republican Party as too radical, fighting its candidates tooth and nail. They understood that as long as the slavocracy dominated the government there was no hope of a Homestead Act, and enough workers fought for land reform to make this issue of importance to labor. Nor did they feel that protective tariff legislation would benefit the industrialists alone, for they sincerely believed that it would protect American labor from the ruinous competition with the cheap labor of the Old World, and enable capitalism in America to provide more jobs. The German-American Marxian socialists also contended that measures such as protective tariffs, which accelerated the growth of capitalism in America, merited labor's support because the development of capitalism was the precondition for the growth and maturing of the labor movement. The New York Tribune was correct when it said on October 9, 1858, "The working men, with very few exceptions, desire a protective tariff, and they begin to see that the slave power is not inclined to accord one, hence they incline to the belief that a few years of Northern ascendancy would be wholesome." While some workers regarded the Republican Party's stand on slavery as too conservative, and only the annihilation of slavery would satisfy them, to most workers, as to most small farmers, the basic issue was not the extermination of slavery but the prohibition of its spread to N areas. Die Sozialrepublik, organ of the Arbeiterbund, expressed the 286 labor movement in the United States. Prevailing working class opinion when it stated on April 24, 1858 that the present question of the present moment is not the abolition of slavery, but the prevention of its further extension. Election of 1856. In the campaign of 1856 labor played a leading role. Workingmen marched in Republican torchlight processions carrying banners which featured the leading slogans of the campaign: "Free soil, free labor, Fremont," and "We won't work for 10 cents a day." Many prominent 48 heirs and labor leaders addressed workingmen's meetings using as their chief theme the second of these slogans. Slave labor in the South, they maintained, drove down the wages of Southern free workers. If slavery were permitted to expand into the North, 10 cents a day would soon be the prevailing wage. In its appeal to the labor vote, the Republican Party reminded the common people that they alone could be relied on to save the country because the majority of the capitalists opposed the new political movement. The capitalists could not be relied upon, for the moment the slave owners threatened secession, men of wealth forgot their convictions and assured the planter aristocrats that they would do anything, submit to anything, to preserve the Union. It was necessary for the workers to rise up against this combined power of money and barbarous brutality. Farmers, workingmen, the Republicans appealed. It is for you to save the country from the combination which threatens to exclude white laborers from the territories and hand them over to the sole occupancy of slaves and slave breeders. 68. This Republican appeal for the labor vote was not campaign oratory, for it was in keeping with the origins of the new party and its platform: an end to the spread of slavery, federal aid for internal improvements, a Homestead Act, and the preservation of civil and political liberties. In the campaign of 1856, a Republican Party pamphlet could honestly say, "The present political contest differs from all previous ones in its direct bearing upon the interests of the laboring class. Other important issues have borne more directly upon capitalists and corporations." The pamphlet then inquired if workingmen thought it possible to serve their interests by voting for that party candidate whose avowed policy it is to bring slave labor into direct competition with that of free men. 69. That masses of American workers understood the issues in the campaign of 1856 is proved by an address issued by 25,000 workingmen of Pittsburgh, including Native Americans, German Americans, and Irish Americans, iron molders, textile workers, coal miners, as well as carpenters, printers, masons, and other skilled mechanics. It bore the title Northern Labor and Slavery. Address of the Workingmen of Pittsburgh to the Fellow Workingmen of Pennsylvania, and went in part: The undersigned, workingmen of the city of Pittsburgh, convinced that our interests as a class are seriously involved in the present political struggle, send greetings to you, our fellow workingmen of Pennsylvania, asking you to aid in the protection of our common rights, now in great peril. Let us look at the facts. In another section of our country exists a practical aristocracy owning labor, and made thereby independent of us. With them labor is servitude, and freedom is only compatible with mastership. They despise us greasy mechanics, filthy operatives, and small farmers doing their own drudgery and unfit to associate with a southern gentleman's body servant, and being gentlemen no doubt believe what they say. The political power of that section is in their hands. From the ignorant and depressed conditions of our fellow workingmen, they're the poor whites, as they call them. These aristocrats desire to extend this system over all the territories of the nation. To extend it over the territories is to give them supreme power over the government, and then they will extend it over us. Free workingmen of Pennsylvania, shall they do it? The present presidential contest is to decide. Could the workingmen cast their votes for the Democratic Party? No, said the workers of Pittsburgh. The Democratic Party was no longer the champion of the rights of man. The present Democratic Party was fighting the cause of the slaveholder. If this party were successful, the slaveholders would take over the territories. Once the slaveholders enter the territories, there would be no inducement for the workingmen to go there, for how would their children be educated? Slavery, said the address, abhors the abomination of free schools. Knowledge for the rich, ignorance for the poor. No hope then, argued the address, could be found in the program of the Democratic Party. The only hope of the workers was the Republican. The address was not overstating its case, because the following remarks appeared in the Richmond Enquirer, February 22, 1856. We have got to hating everything with the prefix free, from the free Negroes down and up through the whole catalogue of abominations, demagogueries, lusts, philosophies, fanaticism, and follies, free farms, free labor, free niggers, free society, free will, free thinking, free love, free wives, free children, free schools. But the worst of these abominations, because when once installed, it becomes the hotbed propagator of all, is the modern system of free schools. A little learning is a dangerous thing to all conservatism of thought, and all stability in general affairs. 288. Labor movement in the United States. Party which opposed the extension of slavery into the territories, and denied the authority of Congress, or any territorial legislature, or any individual, or any association of individuals to give legal existence to slavery in any territory of the United States. Here, fellow workingmen, we find our platform, and under this banner we have enlisted to fight the battle of the rights of man. If we have spoken the truth, then join us. We have all laid aside minor differences in the face of a great danger which has overshadowed minor questions, and have pledged ourselves to an alliance for the preservation of the territories against slavery. We have been met with the cry of sectionalism, fanaticism, abolitionism, but we are not alarmed. On our side, proclaiming the same principles in language too plain to be misunderstood, are Washington, Jefferson, Franklin, Adams, Monroe, Jackson, Clay, and Webster. With these guides we feel that we have not gone astray. Think freely on this great question. Cast away your old prejudices, beware of designing leaders. Study the truth for yourselves, satisfy your minds on the basis of facts and common sense alone, and then strike for yourselves, your fellow workingmen, your country, and the right. 10. This address is probably the most representative statement of the position of most Northern workers on the slavery question before the Civil War. It does not call for the abolition of slavery, but neither does it attack the abolitionists. It emphasizes the point uppermost in the minds of most workers: if slavery were permitted to expand, labor in the North would be reduced to the level of the Negro workers in the South. To extend it over the territories, says the address, is to give them supreme power over the government, and then they will extend it over us. A few months after the election of James Buchanan, the Democratic candidate, the Supreme Court rendered the Dred Scott decision, which ruled that slavery could go into any territory of the United States. The Mechanics' and Workingmen's Central Union of New York City condemned the decision, saying that it was definite evidence of the settled determination of slavery to make itself legal in all of the states, and through the power of the Supreme Court to deprive free labor of the ability to protect itself against the competition of slave labor. 71. Fighting Republican conservatism. Although the Republican Party was defeated in the presidential election of 1856, it made an impressive showing, and in the next 3 years it gained added strength in many parts of the North and West. Nowhere was this more apparent than in Pennsylvania, whose electoral vote was TN. Northern labor and slavery. Be vital in the campaign of 1860. In 1858, the People's Party, the name assumed by the Republican organization in Pennsylvania, carried the city election in Philadelphia and the state election. Both victories, said the Philadelphia North American on September 27, 1858, were won because the People's Party was devoted to the interests of our own working classes. Its slogan, "Popular Sovereignty and Protection to American Industry," won the support of workers and industrialists of Pennsylvania, for the Panic of 1857 had convinced them that it was necessary to link protection of free labor from the competition of slave labor with protection of American labor from the competition of the cheap labor in Europe. There were some misgivings about the protection plank because it was attracting conservative groups into the party who were already trying to tone down the party's stand on slavery. 72 Their frantic attacks against John Brown confirmed these misgivings. Northern workers held mass meetings to express sympathy for John Brown. In Ohio, the Social Work Ing Men's Association of Cincinnati, made up of many German Marxists, drew up a set of resolutions which declared, "The act of John Brown has powerfully contributed to bring out the hidden consciousness of the majority of the people." 78 The German-American workingmen were also the first to remind the Republican Party leaders of their responsibilities to the common people. They were particularly suspicious of certain conservative elements in the Republican Party who had formerly been connected with the anti-foreign-born Know-Nothing movement. In 1858, these groups induced the Republican majority of the Massachusetts state legislature to pass the notorious Massachusetts Amendment withholding suffrage from the naturalized for 2 years. Unless these conservatives were checked, they would dictate the Republican platform and nominate the Republican candidates in 1860. On March 13, 1860, 2 months before the Republican Party's convention, Tyen met in Chicago to nominate its presidential candidate. The German American workingmen of New York City called a special meeting to discuss the issues of the campaign. Here they adopted an important set of resolutions in which they announced their determined opposition to all efforts for the extension and perpetuation of slavery, condemned any infringement on the rights of immigrants by extending the naturalization period, and called for the immediate passage of a Homestead Act. Only when it nominated candidates on the above principles, they declared, could they go hand in hand with the Republican Party. Before adjourning, the German-American workingmen issued a call for a national conference to discuss the issues before the American people and to take steps to prevent conservative forces from taking over the Republican Party. 2 days before the Republican convention opened, a momentous and 29. Labor movement in the United States. Much neglected National Conference of German Americans met in the Deutsches Haus in Chicago. It was a broad conference representing all classes within the German American population, with representatives of the workingmen playing a leading part. Joseph Wiedemeyer, represent. The German American Workingmen's Movement of Chicago, was one of the most forceful and persuasive speakers at the conference. Dr. Adolph Dewey, who had just escaped from a pro-slavery mob in San Antonio, Texas, where he had edited an anti-slavery paper, worked closely with Wiedemeyer. Their influence is seen in the resolutions adopted by the delegates. These resolutions, based upon those passed previously by the German American Republican Workingmen of New York City, requested the German American delegates to the National Republican Convention to submit 5 principles to that body as the sentiment of the majority of the German Republican voters of the Union, and to use all honorable means to secure their recognition in proper form by the National Convention. These principles included opposition to the Massachusetts Amendment, a call for the passage of a Homestead Law, and the demand that Kansas be admitted into the Union as a sovereign state without slavery. In reference to the Republican Party stand on the slavery question, the resolution declared that while we firmly adhere to the principles of the Republican Party as they were laid down in the Philadelphia Platform of 1856, we desire that they be applied in a sense most hostile to slavery. And again, we pledge ourselves to support any aspirant for the presidency and vice presidency who stands on this platform, and has never opposed the Republican Platform of 1856, nor has ever been identified with the spirit of the Massachusetts Amendment. 74 These resolutions were printed immediately after they had been accepted by the delegates to the Republican Convention, thus serving notice that the German Americans, a large number of whom were trade unionists, would give their votes to the Republican Party only if its platform and candidates opposed know-nothingism and the further expansion of slavery. These votes could not be shrugged off lightly. It was generally acknowledged that the German Americans could determine the outcome of the election in a number of crucial states. Just how much influence this document exerted on the Republican Convention cannot be accurately determined. William L. Beringer, who has made a careful study of the Republican Convention of 1860, thinks that the influence was substantial. According to the silence of dozens of convention witnesses concerning the German Convention, he writes, it would seem they had no influence on the convention's deliberations. But their pressure can be seen in the platform and the rapid decline of Bates as Seward's leading opponent. 75. Northern labor and slavery. Lincoln and labor. He should have added that the influence of the Deutsches Haus Conference can be seen in the rapid rise of Abraham Lincoln as Seward's leading opponent, and in Lincoln's subsequent nomination as the Republican standard-bearer. This nomination, it has often been said, was merely the result of pure accident plus vote swapping, log rolling and wire pulling. This ignores the fact that Lincoln already possessed a mass following among the small farmers and workingmen who made up the bulk of the Republican Party. Swedish workers in the Middle West spoke affectionately of Arbeiterson and Lincoln, Lincoln, the son of the working man, and German workers in Illinois showed their devotion to Lincoln by organizing early in 1860 Lincoln for President clubs. In April 1860, the Baltimore Turnzeitung, central organ of the German Turner Bund of the United States, in which workingmen predominated, came out for Lincoln for president. Under a standard-bearer like him, it stated the Republican Party will be certain of victory. 78. The stand taken by the Turnzeitung may come as a surprise to those who have been led to believe that Lincoln was a political nonentity in 1860. Lincoln had already endeared himself to the foreign-born workers by the strong stand he took in opposition to the Know-Nothing movement. In 1855 Lincoln denounced Know-Nothingism and refused to endorse fusion between the Republican and Know-Nothing parties. Of their principles, he wrote, I think little better than I do of those of slavery extensionists. Indeed, I do not perceive how any professing to be sensitive to the wrong of the Negro can join in a league to degrade a class of white men. I have no objection to fuse with anybody provided I can fuse on grounds which I think right. Thereafter Lincoln lost no opportunity to blast away at the Know-Nothing movement. He spoke frequently of the contributions Germans, Irish, French, and Scandinavians had made to American civilization, and said that to him the true mark of American democracy was the fact that men that have come from Europe themselves or whose ancestors have come hither and settled here could find themselves equal in all things in this country. To permit the Know-Nothings to triumph would endanger the finest features of American institutions. Lincoln had also opposed the Massachusetts Amendment. In a letter dated May 17, 1859, to Dr. Theodore Canisius, a prominent German-American editor, Lincoln said that he was against the adoption of the Massachusetts provision. In Illinois, or in any other place where I have a right to oppose it, he added, I have some little notoriety for commiserating the oppressed condition of the Negroes, and I should be strangely inconsistent if I would favor any project for curtailing the exist. 292. Labor movement in the United States. ING writes of white men, even though born in different lands and speaking a different language from my own. The letter received wide publicity and aroused great enthusiasm for Lincoln among German American and other foreign-born workingmen. The same enthusiasm was aroused among workers by Lincoln's clear-cut opposition to the further extension of slavery and by his sympathetic understanding of the problems of the laboring people. No other national political figure of the stature of Lincoln defended labor as strongly as Lincoln did in his New Haven speech of March 6, 1860, in reference to the great shoe strike then in progress. I am glad to see that a system of labor prevails in New England under which laborers can strike when they want to, where they are not obliged to labor whether you pay them or not. I like the system which lets a man quit when he wants to, and wish it might prevail everywhere. One of the reasons why I am opposed to slavery is just here. Lincoln's stand on slavery was one that was understood and appreciated by the workingmen. He was not an abolitionist, but he opposed slavery and its further extension. In March 1860 he said, if you give up your convictions and call slavery right, you let slavery in upon you. Instead of white laborers who can strike, you'll soon have black laborers who can't. Probably no speech Lincoln delivered before the Civil War aroused as much enthusiasm for him among the workers as the one he made in September 1859, at a state fair sponsored by the Wisconsin Agricultural Society. Lincoln attacked the mud-sill theory of labor, which meant that a blind horse upon a treadmill is a perfect illustration of what a laborer should be, and that the education of laborers is not only useless, but pernicious and dangerous. Such a theory was itself useless, pernicious, and dangerous. Free labor, said Lincoln, was the chief bulwark of America's freedom, and it was labor, not capital, which was the source from which human wants are mainly supplied. The mud-sill advocates put capital first and labor last. Lincoln said he stood for the opposite point of view. That labor is prior to, and independent of capital, that, in fact, capital is the fruit of labor, and could never have existed if labor had not first existed, that labor can exist without capital, but that capital could never have existed without labor. Hence labor is the superior, greatly the superior to capital. 77. Northern Labor and Slavery. Election of 1860. 293. It is not an exaggeration to say that the Republican Party fought its way to victory in the campaign of 1860 as the party of free labor. In speech after speech, Carl Schurz asserted that the Republican Party stands emphatically as the party of free labor, and explained its philosophy in a single sentence. To man his birthright, to labor freedom, to him that wants to labor work and independence, to him that works his dues. Henry Wilson, an anti-slavery leader and now a Republican congressman from Massachusetts, defined the issue of the campaign. On the one side is arrayed the Republican Party, vindicating the dignity of free labor and asserting the rights of the toiling millions, while its antagonist is a false democracy, reviling the laboring man as a slave, and prostituting itself to the interests and purposes of a purse-proud oligarch. 7-8. Never before in American history had a political party made such a conscious effort to win the votes of the workingmen as did the Republican Party in 1860. Republican newspapers referred to the party ticket as the working man's ticket. The name, said the Boston/Ornal of June 15, 1860, was justified because both Lincoln and Hannibal Hamlin, the Republican vice presidential candidate, sympathized with the workman in his wants and aspirations. Remembering their own hard toil, they could not fail to foster the interests of free labor whenever opportunity offered. Ben Wade, a Republican leader, justified the term working man's ticket with the statement, Abe Lincoln is the very incarnation of American labor. 79. Three main issues were stressed by the Republican Party in its effort to gain the labor vote. It opposed the further extension of slavery, which would open up the territories to free labor and defend labor from the competition of slave labor. It favored the passage of a Homestead Act which would cut down the competition for jobs in the industrial cities. It stood for protective tariff legislation which promised labor a favored position. A typical Republican appeal went, working men, you who need remunerative labor and homesteads, vote for the friends of both as is demonstrated by past acts, not words. The Republicans hold that the natural conditions of all the territories is freedom, and that they should be kept free, that the landless should have free homes in the territories, and that American industry should be protected. 80. The party's opponents charged that the Republicans ignored the welfare of free labor because all their sympathies are involved in their tenderness for the Ethiopian race. They shut their eyes to the squalor around. Labor movement in the United States. 294. Them, and shed crocodile tears over the imaginary ills of slaves in the South. 81. But the Democrats soon realized that this argument was wasted on workers who saw issues of immense importance in the Republican platform. They then proceeded to whip up a reign of terror. Lincoln's election, they said, would bring secession and ruin, throwing thousands of workers out, LF employment. The Columbus Daily Ohio Statesman of November 2, 1860, warned the workingmen of Ohio. The election of Lincoln, if such a disastrous event should take place, will inflict a blow upon every working man in the North who needs, for the support of himself and family, constant employment and the highest wages he can now obtain. If, therefore, the laborers in Ohio desire themselves and their fellow workmen to remain independent and prosperous, they will vote unhesitatingly for that presidential candidate who is the true friend of free labor, and who can, if they do their duty, defeat Lincoln in Ohio. The second argument the Democrats used was that victory for Republican abolitionism would soon bring thousands of free Negroes to the North to compete with white workers. Even free Negroes in Boston were warned to vote against Lincoln because the emancipation of the slaves following a Republican victory would endanger their jobs. On November 1, 1860, the New York Herald issued a special appeal to Irish and German laborers which was reprinted in many newspapers. If Lincoln is elected, you will have to compete with the labor of 4 million emancipated Negroes. His election is but the forerunner of an ultimate dissolution of the Union. The North will be flooded with free Negroes and the labor of the white man will be depreciated and degraded. Many employers supplemented these appeals with warnings of their own. The Newark Daily Advertiser reported on November 7, 1860, that employers of that city were making no secret of inducing their numerous workmen to vote for the anti-Republican candidates on pain of immediate dismissal in case of their defeat. New York business firms engaged in Southern trade handed out circulars to their workers warning them to vote against Lincoln. By doing so, these circulars promised, "You will take care of yourself and your family. But if the Republican candidate for president is elected, the South will withdraw its custom from us and you will get little work and bad prices." 82. The Republicans urged the workers to hold fast and refuse to be intimidated. Wide awake! Working men attention! The New York Tribune of October 28, 1860 appealed. German fellow citizens, be on your guard. Stand firm for Lincoln and liberty. Be not frightened into Northern labor and slavery. Voting the fusion ticket * by the parasites of slavery. The German workers proved that they would stand firm for Lincoln. The German clothing workers in Brooklyn were called together by their employers and advised to vote against Lincoln if they wished to continue at work. Instead of listening to their employers, socialist workers took over the meeting, which resolved that bosses who refused to pay higher wages and imported scabs to break strikes should not be listened to in political matters. Joseph Wademeyer addressed the workers during the meeting, urging them to vote for Lincoln and to support tariff legislation. 88 The anti-Lincoln reign of terror failed. Of course, there were workers who cast their votes for the Democratic candidates. William H. Silvis of the Molders Union voted for Stephen A. Douglas, as did many Irish voters. A vote for Douglas was not, however, a vote for slavery because Douglas led that section of the Democratic Party which came closest to the Republican Party in its opposition to the extension of slavery and its demand for free soil in the territories. But not all Irish American workers supported Douglas. In New York, Boston, and Philadelphia there were Irish Republican rallies for Lincoln. An Irish American working man of Philadelphia said that he and hundreds of others like him had determined to leave the Democratic Party. They were convinced, he declared, that the party of the slave power could not defend free labor. "I attached myself to the Democratic Party for the reason that the party professed to be the friend of the laboring man, and particularly those of foreign birth. I have been long enough in the party to know that their professions are false, and made only to delude the ignorant in order to secure their votes, and when secured, their rights and interests are ignored." 84 The activity of German American workingmen to elect Lincoln was tremendous. From New York to St. Louis, mass rallies were held in all the cities by these workers for the election of the Republican candidate. Swedish workers were no less active. The Chicago Press and Tribune paid tribute to the German and Scandinavian workers for the zeal and the fusion ticket refers to the consolidation of the anti-Republican parties, the Douglas-BDT-Breckinridge forces, into one ticket of presidential electors. The combined ticket, it was believed, could defeat Lincoln in New York. See Philip S. Foner, Business and Slavery, The New York Merchants, and the Irrepressible Con. Flicht, Chapel Hill, N. C. 1941, pages 172 to 207. Part of the Irish workers' reluctance to support Lincoln was caused by the wide circulation of the impending crisis by the Republican Party. Hinton Rowan Helper's impending crisis attacked the Irish American population as supporters of slavery. "We can well afford to dispense with the ignorant Catholic element of the Emerald Isle," he wrote. "There is so little difference between slavery, papery, and Negro-driving democracy that we are not at all surprised to see them going hand in hand in their diabolical works in humanity and desolation. The impending crisis of the South, How to Meet It, New York, 1860, page 173. 296. Labor movement in the United States. Energy with which they work yesterday to put the finishing touches to the noble service they have rendered in the whole canvas. The Chicago Arbiterbund won special praise for working ceaselessly in rallying labor's support for the Republican ticket. 85 It is impossible to determine how many workers voted for Lincoln. This much is certain. There was strong labor support for Lincoln in Pennsylvania, Missouri, Illinois, Ohio, and New England. The labor vote in Boston, Philadelphia, Cincinnati, Lowell, Chicago, and Trenton went for the Republican candidate, and even in New York City, the northern extension of the Cotton Kingdom, a considerable vote for Lincoln was registered in working-class districts. 86 Republican spokesman admitted the importance of the labor vote in Lincoln's victory. "We owe a debt of gratitude to the laboring men who gave us this victory," said one New York Republican. And Rufus Andrews, a leading Republican, said that Lincoln's election has been affected by the laboring men. The party will try to repay them by a homestead act and a protective tariff. '87 Lincoln's election marked the end of an important stage in the struggle against slavery. Thus far, the struggle had been mainly concerned with preventing its spread to the territories. A small but influential group of men and women had also pushed forward the movement for the abolition of slavery, but most people were as yet not prepared to accept their position. In the great coalition formed to prevent the expansion of slavery, labor was an important, and in some respects a decisive factor. At first it was slow to act, because of the hostility of many abolitionist leaders toward working-class demands, because of affiliation with the Democratic Party, because of fears that emancipation of the slaves would increase competition in the labor market, and because of the confusion created by the pseudo-revolutionary ideas of George Henry Evans and other land reformers. But once these obstacles were overcome, the working class assumed its proper place in the coalition against the slave power. The workers had tipped the scales to end the political domination of our national life by the slave power. Soon the workers were to join in a great people's war, out of which would come the annihilation of slavery, an unfettered capitalism, and a stronger labor movement. 3 days after Lincoln's election, on November 10, 1860, the German paper that was closest to the labor movement, the New Yorker Democrat, outlined in an editorial the tasks facing the progressive forces. "We have taken part in the campaign not as party adherents, not for self-seeking reasons, but because the Republican Party is closest to our point of view and because we consider its victory a guarantee that still greater victories for the cause of humanity can be achieved in the future. It is therefore our special task to see to it that what has been achieved with our help is not again undone, but is built up still more, and if reactionary elements in the party of reaction intend to do that, we must form a counterweight to them and press forward to further gains." This warning was timely. Late in February 1861, shortly before Lincoln's inauguration as President of the United States, a convention of slave owners set up a provisional government at Montgomery, Alabama, with Jefferson Davis as the President of the Confederate States of America. Knowing that their movement to destroy the Union was unpopular among the majority of the Southern white population, the secessionists refused to put the question even before a restricted Southern electorate. "We live under an oligarchy," said the Mississippi Natchez Courier of February 1861, "that has not yet dared to trust the people as to a say to its consent." While the slave oligarchy was engineering secession and preparing for war, President Buchanan did nothing but pray that all would be well in the end, and Northern businessmen, worried over tumbling markets and repudiated debts, were urging Congress to grant the slaveholders any concession that would bring them back into the Union. Naturally, these appeasers wanted to get the support of the workers. As early as November 14, 1860, the pro-slavery New York Herald had appealed. "The events transpiring about us create in the most stoical minds apprehensions of financial trouble of a serious nature, and it is the duty of all classes, great and small, to do all that lies within their power to calm the troubled waters. Above all, there should be an expression of sentiment by the working men, the bone and sinew of the North, in such a way that the South will see that the rabid Republicans, who, with 297. Labor movement in the United States. 298. Their mad cry of elevation of the Negro would destroy the prosperity of the nation, cannot rely upon them to back them up in this wild crusade, that will land us heaven only knows where. Let, therefore, the working men in this metropolis and in every city and town in the northern states assemble in mass meeting as early as possible, and there give utterance to their true sentiments upon the issues of the day. Labor and the secession crisis. Within a few weeks, mass meetings of workingmen were held in many parts of the country, but the sentiments expressed were seldom to the liking of the Herald, which defended the right of the southern states to secede and endorsed any and every concession to slavery. Workingmen of Louisville, Kentucky, at a mass meeting sponsored by the Iron Molders Union, December 27, 1860, elected a committee of 34 to arouse the workers of the nation to preserve the Union. The resolutions adopted at the meeting stated that the workers' material prosperity, hopes of happiness and future security depend upon the continuation of the Union as it is. They called upon their brethren to unite in one solid column for a single purpose, the preservation of the Federal Union, to let the disorganizing traitors who are now at the federal capital plotting treason against the greatest and best government instituted by man know that under the circumstances of our position, furnishing as we do, the nerve, the strength, the skill, in the multiplied industrial interest of the country, and at necessities call freely breasting the tide and brunt of war, we will not desert the gallant old ship of Union, freighted as she is, with the liberty, happiness and prosperity of more than 25 millions of human beings, so long as one timber remains above the surging sea, or one shred of the glorious emblem of our national unity is to be seen at her masthead. In the future, the workingmen of Louisville will not support for office any man who is or may be known to entertain disunion sentiments. 2. These resolutions were not seen as fit to print by the Herald, but the Cincinnati Commercial on January 4, 1861, said of them, The heaviest blow which the secessionists of Louisville have received was from the workingmen of that city. At the same meeting, a committee was appointed to draw up a national address to workingmen. This committee was made up of representatives of Louisville's leading labor organizations, the molders, machinists and blacksmiths, typographers, bricklayers, carpenters, stonecutters, cabinet makers, plasterers, piano makers, boiler makers, cigar makers, and coach makers. Even business was represented in the person of John Gillis, a merchant engaged in labor and the Civil War. 299. The Southern Trade. His presence might explain in part the fact that the address, unlike the resolutions, conjured up the horrors of civil war, and urged the adoption of the Crittenden Compromise. In spite of this weakness, the address stated that all workingmen believed that the preservation of the Union was essential to the welfare of the country and the future happiness of the working class, and that the election of Lincoln did not justify any attempt to destroy the Ion. It called upon the workers to organize meetings in every congressional district and demand the resignation of all members of Congress who were now by their action imperiling the safety of the Union. Some time later, the workingmen were urged to send delegates to a national labor convention to be held in Philadelphia on February 22, 1861.8. The address had a wide influence. Meetings of workers were held in Evansville and New Albany, Indiana, Chicago and Alton, Illinois, Pittsburgh and Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Nashville, Tennessee, Winchester and Wheeling, Virginia, as well as in other industrial towns. Of great importance were the meetings in Maryland, Virginia, and Tennessee, for at these meetings the convictions of Southern free labor were expressed. The tone of their resolutions revealed a uniform hostility to the secessionist oligarchy. At a workingmen's meeting in Baltimore, the secession movement was condemned, the Union and the Constitution upheld, and James Touchstone, a leading anti-slavery figure in Maryland's labor movement, was elected as a delegate to the Philadelphia Convention. Elsewhere in Maryland, miners, mechanics, and laborers calling themselves upholders of the Union and the Constitution met to oppose secession. 5. A meeting of mechanics and workingmen of Frederick County, Virginia, attacked the fanatics of the North and the gasconading folly and sinister selfishness of the demagogues of the South. It characterized the secession of South Carolina as ill-advised, unjust, and disrespectful to her sister states of the South, and stated that the dismemberment of the Union would entail upon us a longer and blacker train of woes than has ever yet, in the providence of God, afflicted any people. 6. In Nashville, Tennessee, a free labor convention declared their undying love for the Union, and called secession treason by designing and mad politicians, calculated to flood the valley of the Mississippi with the blood of freedom. 7. The workingmen of Portsmouth, Virginia declared the Crittenden Compromise provided that the area from the Missouri River to California be divided along the line of 36 degrees 30 foot, slavery forever prohibited north of it, and protected by congressional legislation south of it, that whenever any area was ready to enter statehood, it should be admitted free or slave as its people decided, and that Congress be deprived of its power to abolish slavery where it existed or to interfere with the interstate slave trade. 300. Labor movement in the United States. We look upon any attempt to break up this government, or dissolve this union, as an attack upon the rights of the people of the whole country, and tending to destroy the position of equality assumed by us all, and we hold that the Constitution of the United States is not a league or compact between the states in the sovereign capacity, but a government proper, founded on the adoption of the citizens and itself, and that no power short of convention of the whole Union assembled according to the provisions of the Constitution has power to absolve the citizen from his allegiance to the United States. They concluded their meeting with an appeal to their brethren throughout the country to stand by the Constitution and the Union as the sheet anchor of their hopes. 8. North of the Mason-Dixon line, workers were also holding meetings and passing resolutions against secession. We frowned diligently upon the traitorous action of South Carolina and other states. The workingmen of Wilmington, Delaware, declared in attempting to alienate a portion of this Union from the common brotherhood. 9. A pro-Union meeting of the workers of Newark ended with 3 cheers for the flag, the Constitution, and for Major Anderson, who was holding Fort Sumter. 10. Over in Philadelphia, meetings of workingmen were being held in various shops and factories, culminating on January 26 in a parade and mass meeting. Some of their banners read, "The workingmen of the Pennsylvania Steam Engine and Boiler Works are moving forward for the Union. The Union is the keystone of the country. The Union and the Crittenden Resolutions. We want working men, not talking men. In Congress. Our political machinery is out of order, mechanics must repair it." 11. The theme of the mass meeting was Union and Compromise. When the Crittenden proposals were read by the chairman, many in the audience shouted opposition to the phrases proposing the extension of the Missouri Compromise line to the Pacific. 12. There was protest also. over the dictatorial manner in which the chairman, who was the superintendent of the Pennsylvania Railroad, brushed aside the demand for a nay vote on the Crittenden proposals. Jonathan Fincher, the well-known leader of the Machinists and Blacksmiths Union, severed all official connection with the meeting because of the way in which the milk and water resolutions had been gagged through. Point 13. The last resolution was a fair statement of the position of labor. That if after all fair and honorable means have been exhausted without affecting the desired object so earnestly cherished by all Union-loving citizens, we, as workmen, will sustain the federal government in all just and legal measures to enforce the laws of our land and nation. The Philadelphia Labor and the Civil War. 30i. Inquirer commented on January 20th, I-86I. They are first for peaceable compromise, and if that fails, then and not till then, they are for employing force to maintain the government. If resistance to the slave power was the common conviction of the organized workers, it certainly was not the maximum demand as is seen in the convention in Pittsburgh in January 1861, called by the Typographical Union, whose slogan was, "No compromise with traitors." The convention told the government not to yield an inch to those who threatened and bullied, but to execute its laws against all traitors. 14. A mass meeting of mechanics and laboring men of Easton and Newcastle, Pennsylvania, denounced secession and all compromise, and called upon the administration to take necessary steps in favor of the Constitution and the enforcement of laws. 15. A workingmen's meeting in Cincinnati early in February, 186, declared, "The Union must be preserved in its integrity by the enforcement of the laws in every part of the Union by whatever measures may be necessary." 16. Lincoln was met at his hotel in Cincinnati while en route to his inauguration by a delegation from the German Workingmen's Society, which numbered 2,000 members. Among the delegates were those implacable foes of slavery and the slave power, the Marxian socialists. One of them, Fred Oberklein, delivered the address to Lincoln in which he said that the free workingmen of Cincinnati were opposed to all compromises between the interests of free labor and slave labor. "We, the German free workingmen of Cincinnati, avail ourselves of this opportunity to assure you, our chosen chief magistrate, of our sincere and heartfelt regard. You earn our votes as the champion of free labor and free homesteads. Our vanquished opponents have in recent times made frequent use of the term workingmen and workingmen's meetings in order to create the impression that the mass of workingmen were in favor of compromises between the interests of free labor and slave labor. We firmly adhere to the principle which directed our votes in your favor. If to this end you should be in need of men, the German free workingmen with others will rise as one man at your call, ready to risk their lives in the effort to maintain the victory already won by freedom over slavery." Lincoln assured the delegation that he agreed with these sentiments, and observed that the workingmen are the basis of all governments for the plain reason that they are the most numerous. 17. Opposition to secession always raised the question of labor's independent political action as the best way of dealing with the appeasers in the halls of Congress. A labor convention was called in Cincinnati to 302. Labor movement in the United States, which came delegates from every trade union in the city. They met on February 16, formed a labor party, nominated a workingman's ticket for city officers, and announced, "Resolved, that experience has plainly told no reliance can be placed on party politicians. We, therefore, urge upon the laboring masses the propriety, the imperative necessity of severing party connections, and uniting in organizations from which men can be chosen to administer the laws in an impartial spirit, and whose highest aim will be the promotion of our individual interests and the advancement of our country's good. Resolved, that as upon the laboring classes depends the future of our country, in the present crisis we will not desert it, but will lend our aid to sustain the government in saving the Union from the awful calamities which have overtaken it through the schemes of designing men, and which, if not averted, will eventuate in our common ruin." 18. Late in February 1861, the National Convention opened in Philadelphia. Beginning on February 22 with a grand workingmen's parade, more than 50 trade unions of Philadelphia, led by the molders, machinists and blacksmiths, car builders, carvers, turners, coachmakers, wagon makers, and woodworkers, participated in this great demonstration. The National Convention was national in name only because only delegates from 8 states were present. This comparatively small representation was countered by the fact that these 8 states, Pennsylvania, Maryland, Kentucky, Virginia, Tennessee, Indiana, Ohio, and Delaware, were states closely united to the South by historical and economic ties. Isaac Van Houten of the Pennsylvania Railroad car shops was elected president, and the convention opened its sessions. Many of the speakers called for labor's activity in political affairs. A Mr. Wolfe from Kentucky called for the immediate formation of a united party of workingmen and farmers to save the Union. "What we want to have as our representatives are the workmen, mechanics fresh from the shop and farmers fresh from the field." His proposal was endorsed by other delegates. J. and Burns, representing Philadelphia labor, called for workers from their benches to represent the common people in Congress and carry on the battle against secession. On the following day, the Resolutions Committee presented its report, which contained 8 resolutions. They 1. Endorsed the Crittenden Compromise, 2. Announced devotion to the Union and opposition to all traitors, North or South, 3. Attacked secession as dangerous and repugnant to all workingmen, 4. Warned politicians that the workers were determined to replace them with men from the shops and FAC. Tories s. Condemned a policy of coercion which would lead to civil labor and the Civil War. War 6. Called for the repeal of the personal liberty laws in several northern states which were aimed at preventing the return of fugitive slaves to the South, and 7. Urged the organization of state associations of workingmen in each of the 34 states. An 8th resolution provided for the establishment of a committee of 34 to organize the workers of the country for political action. 19. These resolutions were adopted, permanent officers elected, and July 4, 1861, was set as the date for the next National Labor Convention to be held in Louisville. Just as the convention was about to adjourn, James Touchstone, the delegate representing the workingmen of Baltimore, demanded to be heard in order to submit resolutions which he considered proper to emanate from a representative from a slave state. He prefaced his resolutions with a stirring address against the traitors who had brought the crisis upon the people. The Philadelphia Inquirer carried the following report of the address. It was a crying shame that treason was allowed to show its head all over the land. The Senate and the House of Representatives had been polluted by the presence of avowed traitors, and persons in high and low places had perjured themselves. Treason, as black as any imp of darkness, now stalks through the land, as if in habiliments as pure as those of angels. The workingmen are interested in denouncing the treason. It was inaugurated by aristocrats whose only aim was to place their feet on the necks of the mechanics. It is urged by these disunionists that they are actuated by a desire to repel northern aggression, but 2 wrongs, nor a multitude of wrongs, never made a right, and in this it will never do. It is a plain out-and-out usurpation of the rights of the people by nabobs and aristocrats, and it would be more honorable in the new Confederacy so as to acknowledge it, than to endeavor to deceive the people by a contemptible subterfuge. Those who have started the movement have not done so for the purpose of redressing wrongs, but for the purpose of overturning constitutional liberty and upon its ruins to rear a despotism. This could be seen by following them in their actions thus far. They have increased the taxation. How will workingmen like that? They propose to interfere with the elective franchise by requiring a property qualification. How will mechanics like that? They have elected a president for IO years and propose to allow him a pension on his retirement. How will the mechanics like that? The workingmen should raise their voices against these invasions of their rights. Touchstone moved the adoption of his resolutions which called for the support of the Constitution and for all measures the national government might deem necessary to sustain the lawful authority in putting down labor movement in the United States. Traitors, who would destroy the rights of the people by overturning the government. One resolution said that Cotton is not king, but that the people of the United States are sovereigns. And another resolution stated that this convention sympathized with their brother workingmen of the seceded states, and they pledged them their efforts to regain their constitutional rights, which have been wrested from them by violence. 20. As the resolutions were read, they were greeted by tremendous applause, and many voices called for their adoption, but it was finally decided that it was inopportune to adopt them at a time when important negotiations to settle the crisis peacefully were underway in Washington. Reporters at the convention admitted that although a compromise policy was endorsed, the support given to Touchstone proved that the majority of the delegates favored preserving the Union by force if necessary. 21. The National Convention adjourned on February 23, 1861, never to meet again. A large section, if not the majority of the workingmen, sought to preserve the Union through compromise with the slave owners. This Mr. belief did not come from the working class but was forced on it by other influences. Businessmen, politicians, and newspapers friendly to the slave owners played upon the fears of unemployment. Unless the South were persuaded by concessions to remain in the Union, said these northern allies of slavery, business would go to pieces and mass unemployment would be the future of the working class. The drop in business following the secession of South Carolina and the widespread unemployment resulting from the crisis made these arguments plausible, particularly to the unorganized workers who were suffering the most. 22. Where the economic ties with slavery were strongest, in cities like New. The Committee of 34 did continue its activities for a time. According to William H. Silvis, its corresponding secretary, the committee expected to organize the workingmen for independent political action. In March 1861, Silvis wrote, "The business of this committee is to perfect and perpetuate an organization among the industrial classes of the city and state for the purpose of placing in positions of public trust men of known honesty and ability, men who know the real wants of the people, and who will represent us according to our wishes, men who have not made politics a trade, men who, for a consideration, will not become the mere tools of rotten corporations and aristocratic monopolies. Men who will devote their time and energies to the making of good laws, and direct their administration in such a way as will best serve the interests of the whole people. James C. Silvis, The Life, Speeches, Labors and Essays of William H. Silvis, Philadelphia, 1872, page 45. It is obvious that neither Silvis nor the other trade union representatives on the Committee of 34 realized that the destruction of the slave system was a precondition for effective independent labor political action. Soon enough, however, events themselves were to bring this sharply to their attention. Labor and the Civil War. York, Philadelphia, and Boston, the working class was strongly influenced by businessmen who were ready to surrender every democratic principle to keep their profitable trade relations with the South. Several of the workingmen's anti-war, pro-compromise meetings in these cities were controlled by these businessmen or their politicians. In Philadelphia, the workingmen's movement for compromise was organized by businessmen and trade union leaders. As the movement developed, the businessmen gained considerable control over it. 23 The same thing happened in New York and Boston, where merchants and Southern trade and anti-Republican politicians organized so-called workingmen's meetings which put the blame for the secession crisis on the abolitionists, and called for any concession to the slave owners. 24 Only one worker was allowed to address a meeting at Faneuil Hall, Boston. And when his remarks were thought to be too pro-union and too strongly opposed to secession, they were stricken from the record. All the other speakers, just as at the so-called workingmen's meeting held in Brooks Hall in New York City, were Democratic politicians. 25 An analysis of the pacifist stand of many workingmen on the eve of the Civil War must consider the anti-war campaign conducted for more than a decade by Elihu Burritt. Burritt, in July 1846, formed the League of Universal Brotherhood, devoted to the elevation of man as being, as a brother, irrespective of his country, color, character, or condition. Its members, mainly workingmen, pledged never to enlist in any army or navy, or to render any voluntary support or approval to the preparation for or prosecution of any war, by whomsoever, for whatsoever purpose, declared or waged. A year later, Burritt published a way word to the working men of Christendom, signed by a working man of America. Working men of the United States, voters of a young republic, what example will you set at the polls to the hard-working myriads of your brethren in the old world who lack your right of suffrage to enthrone the sanguinary monster, war? Shall your great officers of the nation be peace and your exactors righteousness? Or shall garments rolled in blood and fiendish feats of human butchery qualify your candidate for the highest honor within the nation's gift? 26. Burritt's pacifist ideas led him to compromise with the slave owners up to the point of allowing them to secede. To prove that they meant what they said when they had petitioned Congress to crush the traitors by force, many workers joined military associations and offered themselves to the federal government. Most of these associations were formed by German workingmen, but some, like the Columbian Association set up in New York City, were organized by 306. Labor movement in the United States. Irish Workers. 27 On February 5, 1861, Colonel Edward F. Jones informed the governor of Massachusetts that the 6th Massachusetts Regiment, made up mostly of men of families, who earn their bread by the sweat of their brows, was prepared to defend the country's flag whenever the call to arms was issued. 28 It is important to understand that the division in working-class circles during the secession crisis revolved only about the question of how the Union was to be preserved. There was no division on the important issue. The Union must and shall be preserved. If peaceful methods failed, the workingmen in nearly all cases were prepared to resort to arms to put down the rebellion. A contemporary workingmen's paper summed it up. The great industrial masses of the nation are of the Union and for the Union, although some of them, in the South, have been betrayed by wicked leaders into a rebellion in which they have no heart, and by which they endure only hardship and suffering. 29. To arms. When President Lincoln called for volunteers after the attack on Fort Sumter, April 12, 1861, workingmen were the first to place their names on the rolls of volunteers. Carpenters, painters, shoemakers, tailors, clerks, mill operatives, printers, and other workers left their jobs unfinished. The mechanics' phalanx of Lowell, led by Captain James N. Horse, a carpenter, won a $100 prize for being the first organization ready for camp. 30 lumbermen in Wisconsin were among the first to enlist and soon became the famed Piney Boys of the 23rd and 29th Regiments. 31 The 34th Regiment of New York, which departed for service in July 1861, was made up, according to the New York Tribune, principally of farmers and mechanics. 32 The DeKalb Regiment, consisting entirely of German clerks, left for service on July 8, at which time the Garibaldi Guard, made up of Italian workingmen of New York, was also ready to depart. The Polish Legion, organized by Polish working men of New York late in April, 186, and a company of Irish workers moved to the front a few weeks later. 33 As the reports of enlistments by Irish workers of Boston and New York increased, the New York Tribune expressed joy at the disappointment of the friends of Jeff Davis, who reckoned upon any assistance from the Irish population of the North. 34,000 of Irish workers later joined the army after the following appeal by the Phoenix Regiment of the Empire Brigade. The Phoenix, the mother of brave Irishmen, calls upon the children of 1428 to rally around her green banner, and marching side by side. Labor and the Civil War. With the Stars and Stripes, carry the music of the Union to the utmost boundaries of the land. 3 investigations conducted during and immediately after the war reveal that before the conflict was over, workers constituted almost half of the Northern armies, a ratio greatly out of proportion to their number. At the close of the war, a Senate report calculated that between 500,000 and 750,000 men had left the industries of the northern states for the armed forces. 36 Since the total number of men employed in northern industries was 941,766, more than 50% of the workers had left for military service. B. A. Gould's investigation in the military and anthropological statistics of American soldiers, published in 1869, tells a similar story. Gould states that of every L.O. soldiers in the Union Army, 421, 252 mechanics, 6 printers, 165 laborers, belonged to the working class. The number per 1,000 for those engaged in agriculture was 487, in the professions, 16, and in commerce, 35. In industrial states like Massachusetts and Connecticut, the percentage of workers was much higher. For Massachusetts, Gould's table lists 502 mechanics, 9 printers, and 186 laborers per 1,000, making a total of 697 as against 140 for agriculture. For Connecticut, the figures are 411 mechanics, 7 printers, and 203 laborers per L.O., making a total of 621. Gould's statistics for volunteers are also significant despite the fact that he lists no figures for New York or Rhode Island. Of 409, 6 volunteers listed for whom occupations were given, 103,708 were mechanics, 49,464 were laborers, and 2,664 were printers, making a total of 155,836 workers. According to Gould's careful study, 38% of all those who volunteered, or about 383 per L.O., were laboring men. The figures for recruits are more revealing, even though the figures from Rhode Island, Minnesota, and Oregon are omitted. Of 229,641 recruits, 64,221 were mechanics, 16 are laborers, 1 foot 499 inches printers, making a total of 124,881 laboring men. In other words, 54% of the recruits were workers. 37. Other studies substantiate Gould's conclusions. Thus, a report of Major Poor of the Massachusetts 8th Regiment giving the occupational composition of the regiment reveals that of the 803 men listed, at least 476 were workers as compared to 22 farmers, 48 clerks, 17 merchants, 31 small tradesmen, 5 gentlemen, and 10 professional men. Again, of the 15th Battery of Lowell, the occupations of the volunteers show 60 workers, 22 farmers, 3 merchants, 2 students, 1 agent, and 1 gentleman. 38. The above figures prove that labor responded in more than full measure to the call to arms. As Major John W. Mahan said in 1865. Employers frequently complained that because of the number of workers who left for the armed forces, industry was being drained of its manpower. The Boston Commercial Bulletin reported on July 18, 1863, that the draft was taking so. 308. Labor movement in the United States. Who was it rallied around the flag in 1861 when Fort Sumter was surrendered? Who was it left without bounty, and without price, that left their homes to sustain the honor of the Republic? I tell you that it was the bone and muscle of the country, and from that time to this, on every bloody battlefield, they have proved their devotion to it. 39. Among these workers were thousands of trade unionists. Entire local unions had enlisted at Lincoln's call for volunteers. In Brooklyn, the Painters' Union resolved to fight as a unit for the maintenance of the flag of our country. 48 Philadelphia local union entered the following in its minutes. It having been resolved to enlist with Uncle Sam for the war, this union stands adjourned until the union is safe or we are whipped. 41 From the Boston Printers' Union, 100 members went to the Army and Navy to do their duty in support of the flag of the free, and members of the Printers' Unions in the 11th Massachusetts Regiment so distinguished themselves that they received special citations. 42 The enlistments. 48. National Typographical Union had to disband Local 23 of Wisconsin because of the large number of members in the Army. The Spinners Union of Fall River, Massachusetts, practically disappeared during the war, and one local of the Iron Molders Union, which had 384 members in February 1861, had lost 97 members within a few months due to so many men who belonged to the International Machinists and Blacksmiths Union had left to fight that the number of locals was sharply reduced. By action of the National Convention, all members of the Union in the armed forces were exempted from payment of dues for the duration of the war. 44 Many companies in the regiments of the Illinois Volunteers were composed of members of the Miners' Union, and the American Miners Association, organized 2 months before the attack on Fort Sumter, sent large numbers of its members into the ranks. 45 The socialist movement in America contributed heavily to the armed forces. The Turner organizations, made up largely of German socialist workingmen, the Arbeiterbund, and the Communist Club, sent more than half their members to the Union Army. In New York, the Turners, many workers from the boot and shoe industry, that it was badly hampered and that some establishments were forced to close down. In December 1863, 35 Boston capitalists addressed a memorial to Secretary of War Stanton in which they complained, "In the free states, the great numbers already drawn from the workshops and fields have seriously embarrassed many branches of the industry upon which the production of the country depends." Quoted by James F. Rhodes, History of the United States from the Compromise of 1850, Volume V. New York, 1905, page 205. Unquestionably, unemployment stimulated enlistments, but many historians have exaggerated its influence. Labor and the Civil War organized a regiment in a few days after Lincoln's first call for volunteers, and in many communities they sent one or more companies. There were 3 companies of Turners in the 1st Missouri Regiment, and the 17th consisted almost entirely of Turners. In the assault of Camp Jackson, the German Socialists of Missouri fought under their red regimental banner on which they had inscribed the symbol of a hammer smashing a handcuff. 46 The statistical records of the men who fell defending the nation do not tell who were trade unionists, but the unions informed the public when one of their members died in the service of his country. The following notice, inserted in the press by the Stone and Hollowware Molders Union No. R. of Philadelphia, is typical. Whereas, it has pleased Almighty God in His providence to remove from our midst our late fellow member, Quartermaster Sergeant David Johnson, we would bear witness to his high character as a man, as a molder, and a soldier, always ready to protect his fellow men or his country. He was among the first who united themselves to protect our interests, and when his country needed his service, among the first to enlist under his stars and stripes, and met his death from a wound received at Briston Station. Therefore be it resolved, that it is with unfeigned regret that we hear of his death, and hope that his zeal may animate all our members. 47. One of the first regiments to move to the defense of Washington was recruited by William H. Silvis. Because of his wife's objections, he had 4 small children. He did not join the company, although he was offered a commission as a first lieutenant. Several months later, he organized a militia company of molders, and when Pennsylvania was threatened with invasion, the Molders Company was the first to offer its services. Silvis served as orderly sergeant with the company for several months. 48 Martin Boyle, a leader of the Miners' Association, raised a company of volunteers of which he was elected captain. So valuable were his services that the colonel of the regiment asked him to recruit another company. 49 John M. Farquhar, president of the National Typographical Union, enlisted in the Union Army as a private in the 89th Illinois and rose to the rank of major. Robert Williamson Keene, leader of the Tailors Union in Philadelphia and later a charter member of the Knights of Labor, enlisted at the outbreak of the war for 3 months' service in the 22nd Pennsylvania, re-enlisted in the 99th Pennsylvania for 3 years, was wounded severely at the Battle of Fredericksburg, December 13, 1862, and took the field again when he recovered. Samuel Langdale Leffingwell, president of the Cincinnati Typographical Union, was commissioned a major in the 31st Ohio in August. 310. Labor movement in the United States. 186R, and fought in the Union Army throughout the entire war, receiving his honorable discharge on June 2, 1865. Isaac J. Neal, ex-president of the National Molders Union, was wounded, re-enlisted and became a captain, while Francis Roche, national ex-treasurer, was killed in action. 50 Many socialist leaders joined the Union Army and some attained positions of high rank. Joseph Wademeyer, one of the outstanding leaders of the German-American workingmen, enlisted when the Civil War began and received a captaincy commission. Later, because of his work in recruiting an entire regiment of German-American workers, as well as for other distinguished service, he was commissioned a colonel and assigned by Lincoln as commander of the military district of St. Louis. August Willich, a close friend of Karl Marx, rose to the rank of colonel and in 1862 became a brigadier general. Robert Rosa, who had been an officer in the Prussian army before he became a member of the Communist Club of New York, was major of the 45th Regiment of New York. Fitz Jacoby enlisted as a private and attained a lieutenancy commission before he died on the field of Fredericksburg. A great number of the rank-and-file trade unionists and labor and socialist leaders in the Union Army were foreign-born, and quite a few of them had not yet become citizens, but they did not hesitate to offer their lives to their adopted country. Most of them, like the Italian workingmen who had fought under Garibaldi, brought with them military experience obtained through service in the armies of Europe. Fighting for what? The following section of a resolution adopted on May 2, 1861, by the Troy Local of the International Molders Union is a representative statement of the reasons which motivated most workers who joined the Union Army after the firing upon Fort Sumter. Whereas a goodly number of the members of the Troy Iron Molders Union have enlisted in the Army of the United States for the ostensible, purpose of maintaining the supremacy of law and order and defending the Constitution so wisely drafted by the Sons of 76 and also the federal capital, and last but not least to protect that good old flag, the Stars and Stripes. 51. Men like Wademeyer and Willich knew from the outset of the war that it could not be won unless the Negro people were emancipated. Other workers shared their views. One worker wrote home to his Union brethren early in the war, "I tell the boys right to their face that I am in the war for the freedom of the slaves." And William H. Silvis, who Labor and the Civil War had supported Douglas in the election of 1860, said that, "From the day the first gun was fired, it was my earnest hope that the war might not end until slavery ended with it." 52. The logic of waging a people's war successfully made the workers understand that the abolition of slavery was necessary for military victory. Thousands of Negro slaves were being used in southern factories, iron foundries, machine shops, munition plants, and textile mills to produce the means of war for the Confederacy. Many thousands more were used in the cotton and corn fields, releasing white Southerners for the battlefront. The slave owners boasted that the institution of slavery would win the war for them. The Savannah Republican stated, "They, the Northern people, forget the peculiar character of our institutions, the permanency of our industrial system, the fact that the labor of the South is not, as elsewhere, the fighting element of the state. When wars occur in Europe or at the North, you take the laboring man from the plow, the workshop and the factory to fight for them. Production, to the extent of the force required, must accordingly cease. In the southern, and especially the cotton-growing states, the case is entirely different. A wholly different system of labor prevails. Our cotton fields are tilled by slaves, and Georgia alone might send 20,000 troops to the field, without diminishing the production of her staple to the amount of 100 bales. 53. When in August 1861, General John C. Fremont issued his order freeing the slaves of rebels in Missouri, many workers in Pittsburgh, Lowell, and other industrial communities hailed his action, and the chorus of disapproval which came from these workers when Lincoln revoked the order was tremendous. Anti-slavery men reported that in many cities where a few months before only a handful of abolitionists could be found among the workingmen, there were now hundreds of workers who understood the need for prosecuting the war till slavery is wiped out. 64. As the cry for emancipation developed among the workers, the northern allies of the slavocracy tried to frighten them by threats and stories of disaster. Unless the workers opposed the plot of the abolitionists to have slaves overrun the North, all would be lost. Already, said the traitors of the Civil War, employers had discharged white workers to make jobs for escaped slaves. On June 5, 1862, the Pennsylvania-Indiana Democrat published a false report that workers at the Cambria Iron Works threw down their tools and quit work. After, worthless runaway Negroes of the South were employed for 25 cents a day. Our friends. 312. Labor movement in the United States. Can see in this the beautiful workings of the emancipation policy of President Lincoln. 55. Though the paper was forced by the very men who were supposed to have struck to retract the article as a lie, the Copperhead press throughout the North printed the story and wrote impassioned editorials protecting white workers from the Southern menace. Here and there workers were taken in by their propaganda, and a mass meeting in Quincy, Illinois, adopted resolutions stating that they would not tolerate the competition of free Negro workers. 56. The letters, telegrams, and petitions to President Lincoln in behalf of emancipation defeated the Copperhead campaign. The Iron Platform, a New York workingman's paper, gave in November 1862 the reason that had compelled it to call for the freedom of the slaves. There is one truth which should be clearly understood by every working man in the Union. The slavery of the black man leads to the slavery of the white man. If the doctrine of treason is true, that capital should own labor, then their logical conclusion is correct, and all laborers, white or black, are and ought to be slaves. 51. Educated by the people and prodded by military necessity, Lincoln was beginning to see that emancipation was absolutely essential for the salvation of the Union, that we must free the slaves or be ourselves subdued. Instead of deferring, as in the past, to pro-Southerners like General George B. McClellan, who warned that any expression of radical views upon slavery would rapidly disintegrate our armies. Lincoln now leads 10 to the cry coming from factories and fields. Emancipate, emancipate. 58. English workers and the Civil War. This cry was not confined to the workers and farmers of the United States, but it came from the people of Europe as well. It was not the wisdom of the ruling classes, said Karl Marx, but the heroic resistance to their criminal folly by the working classes of England that saved the west of Europe from plunging headlong into an infamous crusade for the perpetuation and propagation of slavery on the other side of the Atlantic. 59 of all nations, England was the most influential in the Civil War. Not only did she possess the biggest navy in the world, but France was quite willing to cooperate with her in whatever policy she adopted toward America. As Lord John Russell informed George M. Dallas, the American minister to England, the two countries had formally agreed to labor and the Civil War take the same course as to recognition, whatever the course might be. 60. When the news of the Battle of Bull Run reached Europe proving that the South had an army which could win battles, England recognized the belligerency of the Confederacy, and on the day that the American ambassador, Charles Francis Adams, reached London, Queen Victoria issued her proclamation of neutrality. This was the first step that the Confederacy believed would lead to military intervention in its behalf. That the intervention never came was in part the result of Russia's refusal to join England against the North. Also, the businessmen of England were of a divided mind because their country was dependent upon the North for wheat, and English businessmen were making huge profits from both contestants. 61 By far the most important force in preventing recognition of the Confederacy and intervention in its behalf were the heroic efforts of the English workers. In England, wrote Thurlow Weed, who spent a great deal of time in the British Isles during the Civil War. The commercial cities, the capitalists, and as a rule, the aristocracy were against us. But they did not have their way. The working classes were with us. 62 Karl Marx wrote to the New York Tribune. It ought never to be forgotten in the United States that at least the working class of England from the commencement to the termination of the difficulty have not forsaken them. 63 A slaveholder had warned William Russell of the London Times that when cotton no longer came to England, the workers would starve and would soon clamor for intervention to break the northern blockade. By 1862, but a small fraction of American cotton got through the blockade. The great textile centers closed down, and unemployment spread to other industries. On February 11, 1862, the London Times reported 900,000 people out of work of a population of 20 million in England and Wales. A few months later, it was estimated that 31.8% of the population of many industrial cities were unemployed. 64 A letter printed in the London Times in April 1862 tells of the suffering of the workers. I am living in the center of a vast district where there are many cotton mills, which in ordinary times afford employment to many thousands of hands, and food to many more thousands of mouths. With very rare exceptions, quietness reigns. Hard times have come, and we have had them sufficiently long to know what they mean. We have fathers sitting in the house at midday, silent and glum, while children look wistfully about, and sometimes whimper for bread which they cannot have. We have the same fathers who, before hard times, were proud men, who would have thought beggar the most opprobrious epithet you could have hit them with, but who now are made humble by the sight of wife and children almost starving, and who go before. 314. Labor movement in the United States. Relief committees and submit to be questioned about their wants with a patience and humility which it is painful, almost shocking to witness. But harder than this, our factory women and girls have had to turn out, and plodding a weary way from door to door, beg a bit of bread. To see the homes of those whom we know and respect, though they are but workingmen, stripped of every bit of furniture, to see long-cherished books and pictures sent one by one to the on shop, that food may be had, and to see that food almost loathsome in kind, and insufficient in quantity, are hard things to bear. But these are not the worst things. In many of our cottage homes, there is nothing left by the pawning of which a few pence may be raised, and the mothers of us Lancashire lads have turned out to beg, and ofttimes knock at the doors of houses in which there is as much destitution as there is in their own, while the fathers and lads themselves think they are fortunate if they can earn a shilling or two by street sweeping or stone breaking. 611. These workers and their dependents did not, as the slaveholders expected, clamor for intervention on the side of the Confederacy. By supporting the North, the English workers knew that they were strengthening their own struggles for freedom, for as one English worker at a trade union meeting in London said, "The cause of labor and liberty is won all over the world." 66 On November 1861, Captain John Wilkes, commander of the American warship San/Jacinto, stopped the British mail steamer Trent and removed two Confederate commissioners, Mason and Slidell, and their secretaries. The Tory press in England seized upon the incident and demanded that war be declared against the North. The British government immediately threatened to do this unless the men were released at once. The corrupt press of France urged Louis Napoleon to side with England. Although most English workers could not vote, they made their influence felt through meetings and demonstrations. At public meetings throughout the country, the workers insisted on settling the Trent affair through arbitration. At one such meeting in Brighton, Mr. White, an influential member of Parliament, said, "It is due to the working class to mention that they are the originators of this meeting, and that all the expenses of organizing it are borne by their committee." 67. At a meeting in Marylebone, the most populous district of London, the following resolution was unanimously adopted. This meeting resolves that the agents of the rebels, Mason and Slidell, now on the way from America to England, are absolutely unworthy of the moral sympathies of the working class of this country, since they are slaveholders as well as the compound essayed agents of the tyrannical faction that is at once in rebellion. Labor and the Civil War. Against the American Republic and the sworn enemy of the social and political rights of the working class in all countries. 68. Mr. Gilpin, MP for Northampton, declared in January 1862 that there was not a man of sufficient eloquence or ability who could obtain the adoption in any fairly gathered meeting of the workingmen of this country, in any part of the kingdom, a resolution in favor of slavery. 69. Nor was there any use in arguing that breaking the blockade through intervention would restore prosperity. The answer of the workers was clear. No matter what the suffering we may endure, no matter what the sacrifices we may have to undergo, we will not allow our government to depart from the strict principle of neutrality on behalf of the slave-holding Confederacy. 70. But one argument did have influence, and did succeed in confusing many workers. Why suffer, said English papers friendly to the South, why endure misery and hardships for a cause the North itself does not champion? The North was not fighting to free the slaves. Did not McClellan assure the slaveholders when he took command that they should have no fear that the Union Army would interfere with slavery? Did not McClellan promise them that he would crush with an iron any slave insurrection? Had not Lincoln revoked the orders of Generals Fremont and Halleck to free the slaves in their districts? The view that the war between the North and South was over slavery was as impudent as it was untrue. Why starve and sacrifice for a war that was being fought between Republicans and Democrats over protective tariffs and banking systems? Why not restore British prosperity by breaking the Northern blockade? 71. Pushed by the common people of America, and anxious to inspire the working class and middle class in Europe to oppose all efforts of their governments to aid the Confederacy, Lincoln began to move. On March 13, 1862, he approved an act of Congress forbidding Army and Navy officers to use their forces to return fugitive slaves, any officer violating the order to be dismissed from the service. A month later, slavery was abolished in the District of Columbia, with compensation for the owners. On June 9, 1862, the Senate passed a bill providing suffrage for free Negroes in Washington, and a day later a resolution passed through Congress securing fugitives the right of trial by jury and placing the burden of proof upon the claimant to establish his ownership of the slave and his loyalty to the Union. Then on September 22, 1862, Lincoln issued a preliminary Emancipation Proclamation which announced that all slaves belonging to persons who were still in rebellion on January 1, 1863, would be free. 72. Although these steps aroused joy among the common people of America and England, they still feared that reactionary forces might stop. Labor movement in the United States. Emancipation at the last moment. Then began an avalanche of petitions, letters, and telegrams from working class and farming districts in America urging Lincoln to stand fast and carry through emancipation. In England, too, the workers were determined to encourage Lincoln to continue until slavery was abolished. When, on January 1, 1863, President Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, Confederate hopes for English intervention received a crushing blow. From London, Henry Adams, son of the American ambassador to England, sent a joyful dispatch to his brother. "It is creating an almost convulsive reaction in our favor all over this country. The London Times is furious and scolds like a drunken drab. Certain it is, however, that public opinion is very deeply stirred here and finds expression in meetings, addresses to President Lincoln, deputations to us, standing committees to agitate the subject and to affect opinion, and all other symptoms of a great popular movement peculiarly unpleasant to the upper classes here because it rests on the spontaneous action of the laboring classes." 4 weeks after the proclamation, Henry Adams wrote again to his brother, "I went last night to a meeting of which I shall send you a report, a democratic and socialistic meeting, most threatening and dangerous to the established state of things, and assuming a tone and proportions that are quite novel and alarming in this capital. And they met to notify the government that they will not tolerate interference against us." 7. The organizers of this meeting were Karl Marx and Frederick Engels. From the outbreak of the war, Marx and his followers supported the North because they knew that the destruction of slavery in America would unfetter American capitalism, expand bourgeois democracy in America and Europe, thus making possible the further advance of the working class movements the world over. Marx was convinced that. On March 26, 1863, Adams attended a large meeting of trade unionists at St. James's Hall in London. The report which he submitted to the State Department remained unpublished until 1942. In the report, Adams emphasized that the meeting was attended by about 3,000 persons. All, with the exception of a few invited guests, the members of the working classes, or, technically, skilled laborers. The speakers, he went on, were all laboring men, trained no doubt in their own unions to declamation, but evidently themselves sprung from the heart of the people. The speakers emphasized that their interests, and those of the American Union, were one, that the success of free institutions in America was a political question of deep consequence in England, and that they would not tolerate any interference unfavorable to the North. There could be no mistaking the manner in which the audience echoed these sentiments of the speakers, nor could anyone doubt what was intended. Charles I, Glicksburg edition. Henry Adams reports on a Trades Union Meeting. New England Quarterly, Volume 15, December, 1942, pages 724-28. Labor and the Civil War. The North could win only if it conducted the war in a revolutionary manner for the annihilation of slavery. 75 On September 28, 1864, the first international organization of labor was formed, the International Workingmen's Association. 2 months later, the General Council of the Association organized a series of workingmen's meetings in London to protest against the anti-union attitude of the English government. How important this work was to American interests was admitted by Senator George Hoar of Massachusetts, speaking in Congress in 1879. The International Association of European and American Workingmen has this title to respect, among other, that it has established among the nations of the world a relation, that it has recognized a kindred between man and man, growing out of the common bond of labor, greater, more powerful, more binding than any mere national attachment, or than any tie which connects the subject to the sovereign. America is the last nation that ought to be ungrateful for that sublime accomplishment. In the darkest days of our own war, when the governing classes of England would have been glad to have joined the Emperor of France in recognition of the Southern Confederacy, what prevented it was the angry growl of the workingmen of Lancashire, saying to the English government, "We love the workingmen of North America a great deal better, we are more nearly allied in interest and in feeling to the workingmen of America than we are to the aristocracy of England, and though we have borne many things from you, one thing we will not bear, that you shall array the power and might of England against the cause in which those American workingmen are engaged." 16. Contributions of Negro workers. By their deeds at the front and in production, the Northern workers proved worthy of their English brothers, and by their service to the Union cause during the war the Negroes proved that they earned their freedom. Even before the Emancipation Proclamation, Negro slaves had helped the Union Army at every opportunity. Slaves assisted the Federal armies as they marched south, bringing Union commanders valuable information and sabotaging the Confederacy's war effort. The capture of the Confederate steamer Planter by Robert Smalls is one example of the heroism and resourcefulness of the Negroes during the Civil War. The captain and the white crew absent, Smalls took command of the ship and, disguised as the Confederate captain, gave the proper signal to Fort Sumter, getting beyond the range of its guns before the ruse was discovered. The Planter was delivered to the Federal fleet outside Charleston Harbor. Labor movement in the United States. 318. So valuable was the information which Negro slaves gave to Union generals that Confederate commanders often sent out large detachments to clear the country of Yankee Negroes. In Missouri, slaves were particularly active in aiding the Union officials to root out guerrilla bands. Once the entire command of General Banks was saved from a surprise attack by the action of a mounted slave who raced ahead of Confederate troops to give warning of their approach. 77 Several months before the Emancipation Proclamation, Negroes were serving the Union cause by constructing fortifications and entrenchments, working even when they had no shoes to drive their shovels into the ground. Others were employed in building railroads, cutting wood to supply fuel for steamboats, and loading and unloading government boats. They were also in the blockading service of the Union Army, working as carpenters, stevedores, pilots, gunners, and ordinary seamen. 78. Escaped slaves frequently supplied valuable information concerning Confederate activities. In December 1861, 2 Negroes visited the USS Monticello, anchored off Wilmington, North Carolina, and gave a detailed description of the Confederate fortifications at New Inlet and Zeke's Island. After the capture of these fortifications, the Navy paid tribute to the assistance rendered by the slaves. Equally useful were the Negro slaves in securing supplies for the Northern armies in enemy country. They helped cavalry commanders replace worn-out horses, and brought cattle, food, and forage to troops who could not advance for lack of supplies. 79 As early as May 1, 1862, The New York Tribune urged Union commanders to use slaves as scouts and spies and warned officers who refused their help that they were depriving the Union Army of important allies. They know the country. They are accustomed to midnight journeys through forest, swamp, and thicket, avoiding the highways. They are accustomed to keep out of sight and hearing and to find food where a white man must go without. When the arming of Negroes became law, thousands joined the colors. By 1864, about 186,017 Negroes were serving as federal troops, of whom 134,111 were from slave states. Of this number, 68,178 gave their lives. Commenting on this fact, the New York Tribune said on December 26, 1865, "The Negro gave 1 in 3 of his number to the cause of freedom. Did we, with all our valor, do half as well?" 80 Negro soldiers endured shameful discrimination. They received less pay than white soldiers until July 1864. Few Negroes were commissioned as officers, and many were forced to perform arduous tasks in addition to fighting. Nevertheless, following the leadership of Frederick Douglass, who urged his people not to permit discrimination to blind them to the full significance of the war, Negroes continued to join the army and fought with distinction. Negro soldiers fought in 198 battles and Labor and the Civil War. Skirmishes. In May 1863, General Banks assured Lincoln that the victory at Port Hudson could not have been accomplished at the time it was, but for their Negro troops' assistance. 81 This regiment of Negro troops had been assigned to storm the key position of the rebel works, and so intrepid was their charge that it won nationwide admire. Tie-in. "Until I joined the Negroes," wrote John Worthington Ames, who assumed command of a Negro regiment in August 1863, "I never saw the enemy's works carried by assault. I never saw guns captured and never knew of captured guns to be used against the enemy. Our Negroes have never failed in all these things." 82 Similar testimony came from Colonel Thomas Wentworth Higginson, who commanded a detachment of Negroes in Florida. "It would have been madness," he wrote in February 1863, "to attempt with the bravest white troops what I successfully accomplished with black ones." 88 It was in guerrilla fighting that the Negro soldiers excelled. Squads of Negro troops went into rebeldom, destroyed supply stores, salt works, munition dumps, and brought out lumber and other supplies needed in the North. They always brought back new recruits for the Union Army. A North Carolina paper in 1864 reported that it was difficult to find words of description of the wild and terrible consequences of Negro raids in this obscure theater of war. 84 No one gave more brilliant service than that remarkable woman, Harriet Tubman. No one knew the country better than she. Her years of working in the Underground Railroad had given her matchless knowledge. In 1863, the Army agreed that she give up her work as a nurse in military hospitals and organize a guerrilla brigade to operate in South Carolina. Selecting a group of former slaves who were familiar with the country, she and Colonel Montgomery began operations. How they worked is told in the following dispatch, which appeared in the Boston Commonwealth of July 10, 1863. Harriet Tubman, Colonel Montgomery and his gallant band of 300 black soldiers, under the guidance of a black woman, dashed into the enemy's country, struck a bold and effective blow, destroying millions of dollars worth of commissary stores, cotton and lordly dwellings, and striking terror to the heart of rebeldom, brought off near 800 slaves and thousands of dollars worth of property, without losing a man or receiving a scratch. It was a glorious consummation. After the expedition, the new recruits were addressed by Colonel Montgomery, who was followed by a speech from the black woman, who 320 Labor movement in the United States led the raid and under whose inspiration it was originated and conducted. When Lincoln was pressed by defeatists, in 1864, to abandon the use of Negro troops and discharge those already in service, he replied, "There are now in the service of the United States near 200,000 able-bodied colored men, most of them under arms, deaf, ending, and acquiring Union territory. Abandon all the posts now garrisoned by black men. Take 200,000 men from our side and put them into the battlefield or cornfield against us, and we would be compelled to abandon the war in 3 weeks." 85 From the ranks of the workingmen, white and Negro alike, had come a large portion of the men who did the actual fighting in the Civil War. It was on a note of pride that the Boston Daily Evening Voice, organ of the trade unions of New England, concluded an elaboration of labor's contribution to Northern victories. On December 27, 1864, it declared, "Thousands of laboring men have marshaled themselves under the flag of the free to maintain the integrity of the government and vindicate the supremacy of the law. To prevent the dismemberment of our glorious republic, they have abandoned their occupations and their homes, and are making a sacrifice of blood on the altars of their country. The strong right arm of the working man is our country's sure defense in her hour of trial. Every battlefield attests their devotion to country and their love of freedom." Labor's contribution during the Civil War at the battlefront and in the rapidly expanding factories of the North is one of the most inspiring chapters in American history. But historians have either neglected labor's role or have regarded it only in its connection with the draft riots. These riots, they contend, were proof that labor did not champion the war, gave it only sullen support throughout, and rejected its idealistic purposes. 1. Labor in the draft. The truth is that labor did not oppose conscription but rather its class character, the drafting of the poor and not of the rich, of men and not of wealth. This attitude of labor was articulated both by Pincher's Trades Review, the outstanding labor journal of the time, and by William Silvis, the foremost labor spokesman of his period. The labor paper declared, "For the sake of the country let the conscription come. But let it come upon the rich as well as the poor." 2. And Silvis argued that had the workers said they would not enter the army, Congress would have ordered the armed soldiers to enter the workshops, and forced us into the army, and that would have been perfectly right. Now, if it wanted money, could it not have done the same thing? If it has the right to take every man, has it not the right to take every dollar also? 3. But the Conscription Act, adopted in 1863, was discriminatory. It contained a clause which made it legally possible to evade service by providing a substitute, or by paying a $300 commutation fee. The result was, as the National Anti-Slavery Standard pointed out, that the act granted a virtual release from the draft for the comfortable class. For so unusual was it to find a wealthy capitalist or his son in the armed forces that those who served were regarded almost as social outcasts. 321. 322. Labor movement in the United States. Judge Mellon of Pennsylvania, founder of the Mellon fortune, told one of his sons who wished to serve that it was only greenhorns who enlist. 5. That workingmen should have been agitated by the injustice of the Conscription Act was hardly surprising. Nevertheless, the trade unions and the labor press urged workers to abide by the law while campaigning to amend it. In the main, this advice was followed, especially by the organized workers. But a small section of the working class, chiefly the unorganized, succumbed to Copperhead propaganda. The Copperheads took full advantage of the class nature of the Conscription Act. Posing as friends of labor, they denounced through their press the provision which permitted all who possessed $300 in greenbacks filched from the people to escape military service. 6 handbills carrying the words of the Song of the Conscripts were circulated by the thousands in the summer of 1863 in the labor sections of New York and other cities. A typical excerpt went: "We're coming, Father Abraham, 300,000 more. We leave our homes and firesides with bleeding hearts and sore. Since poverty has been our crime, we bow to thy decree. We are the poor who have no wealth to purchase liberty." 1. What would the workers fight for? The Copperheads asked. And they replied, to enable abolition capitalists to transport Negroes into northern cities in order to replace Irish workers who were striking for higher wages. 8. The New York Copperhead urged workingmen to obey only laws which give the poor equal privileges with the rich. While the Daily News wrote, "The people are notified that 1 out of about 2.5 of our citizens are to be brought off into Messrs. Lincoln and Company's charnel house. God forbid! We hope that instant measures will be taken to prevent this outrage." 9. The treasonable campaign of the Copperheads helped to incite bloody and destructive draft riots. On July 13, 1863, a few days after the opening of recruiting, a mob in N.W. York City wrecked the main recruiting station. For 3 whole days the mob roamed through the city, destroyed shipyards, railroad and streetcar lines, closed factories and machine shops, attacked the homes and offices of leading Republicans, and killed and wounded an undetermined number of Negroes. Before the riot was quelled, upward of 400 were killed and wounded, and property estimated at $5 million in value was destroyed. 10. The rioting spread to other cities. In Troy, New York, 300 men from the Rensselaer Iron Works and the Albany Nail Works marched through the streets declaiming against the draft, sacked the Times office, threatened to burn the African church, broke open the labor and the Copperheads jail and released the prisoners. In Hartford, Indiana, and in Port Washington, Wisconsin, and in some of the mining districts of Pennsylvania, recruiting boxes were smashed and commissioners driven out of town. Here, in the mining areas, workers' indignation was heightened when it was suspected that mine operators had influenced officials to set a higher quota for the mining districts in order to break the miners' union. 11. The Copperheads had partly attained their objective. Without premeditated organization, they boasted, the working classes protested in force against the federal draft which would tear from dependent families their sole support. 12. But the Democratic Republican Workingmen's Association of New York, composed of representatives from the typographical, hatters, carpenters, and cabinetmakers' unions, exposed the Copperhead contention. The workingmen of New York did not originate the riots of 1863, declared the association after a careful investigation. They were the result of long and careful labors on the part of a class of leaders who succeeded in arousing the prejudices of a small number but sufficient to produce great and direful results. The workingmen of New York are not rioters. A few reckless and dissolute men, who vibrate between the penitentiary and the dark dens of crime, are not the representatives of the workingmen of the metropolis. 13. At workingmen's mass meetings, it was pointed out that only a small fraction of the working class had joined the rioters, that most workers in the mob had been dragged out of their shops by the threat that resistance would mean death. The very communities which resisted conscription had previously furnished plenty of volunteers, most of them workers. And it was further revealed that the Irish had already furnished more troops to the federal armies in proportion to their number than had native-born Americans. Speakers referred to the magnificent battle record of New York's famous Fighting 69th, and of other brave Irish regiments. 14 At a meeting in New York City, Patrick Keady, the president of the New York Practical House Painters Association, read the text of a letter he had sent to the members of the Union, most of them Irish workingmen. I do not for a moment suppose that any of you took part in the late riots. You are too well aware of your own interest to do that, but you can in many ways exercise your influence to prevent recurrence of such. The fact that a leading provost marshal in charge of conscription in Pennsylvania was a notorious anti-Union mine operator added weight to the suspicion. William A. Itter, Conscription in Pennsylvania During the Civil War, unpublished doctoral dissertation, University of Southern California, 1941, page 144. 324. Labor movement in the United States. Disgraceful scenes as were then enacted, scenes which prove that it was not the honest workingmen that engaged in this, but thieving rascals of this and adjacent cities, who have never done a day's work in their lives, and who came here for the purpose of plunder and not to resist. The draft. I ask you then as a friend, to do all in your power to prevent a repetition of this loss of life and wholesale destruction of property which must ever result from the enactment of such scenes. I have read the lists of those who have been arrested, and I do not notice the name of a single painter among them. This is certainly very creditable when it is known that many painters live in this city. Will you keep this record unstained? Will you do all in your power to induce others who are not present to do the same? 15. Trade unionists pointed out that during the height of the disorders a group of socialists braved the fury of the mob and distributed a leaflet exhorting the workers to stand by the Union, the Constitution and the laws. Keep honestly at your work. 16. Stand by the Union. This slogan rose again and again throughout the war from the trade unions and the labor press. When President Lincoln issued a call in October 1863 for 300,000 more men, Pincher's Trades Review promptly appealed to workingmen to respond for, "Unless we rally round the flag, boys, we shall have no country." 11. More than 3 months later, the same labor paper greeted another draft with pride at knowing it, Labor L is competent to honor the call. This time, the labor paper took occasion to warn the imperialist European governments, particularly those of England and France, to take heed how they trifle with the wishes of a nation of freemen, who are willing to stake their existence upon their attachment to a principle. 18. Copperhead propaganda. Were it not for the activity of organized labor and its press, the Copperheads might have succeeded in their treacherous drive to paralyze totally the war effort of the government of the United States. The Copperheads, moreover, did not limit their machinations to provoking riots. They also launched a campaign for a negotiated peace with the slave aristocracy. "Stop the war!" shrieked Cyrus H. McCormick, the reaper and harvester magnate and a leading Copperhead. "Declare an armistice! Call a Khan! Vent ion and consider terms of peace." 19. For the Copperheads feared the Civil War as a revolutionary war which aimed at a reign of terror similar to that which disgraced the French Revolution. The abolitionists, they said, were fanatics and revolutionists, whose ultimate objective was a socialist society. 20. Labor and the Copperheads. At the same time, they posed as champions of labor's interests, contending that labor had nothing to gain and everything to lose by supporting and continuing the war. The substitute clause in the Conscription Act, cried the Copperheads, was merely one more evidence of the administration's disposition to grant favors to the wealthy at the expense of the poor. Moreover, they argued the government's policies permitted the owners of industry to intensify their exploitation of the poor. The war was creating in America a system like that of England, which pauperizes the masses and robs them of the rewards of their toil to feed a pampered aristocracy. Already it had enriched the few at the expense of the many, made the rich richer and the poor poorer, and forced the worker to take, as pay for his labor, a depreciated currency which enhances his living 1, 2, and in some cases 300%. To make matters worse, the Copperheads continued, the Emancipation Proclamation had loosed thousands of Negroes upon the North who crowded white workers out of jobs, cheapened the cost of labor, and formed an army of strikebreakers. to put down the white laboring classes. 21.